The death of Louis the Great marked a turning point that shook the foundations of royal authority in Hungary. Until then, the loyalty of the barons had been closely tied to the strength and personality of the king. With his passing, that bond dissolved almost instantly. No successor could command the same authority, and the political balance quickly shifted. Power drifted into the hands of the royal council, where influential families pursued their own ambitions rather than the interests of the crown. Within just a few years, the centralized monarchy Louis had built faded into memory, replaced by instability and competition. The extinction of the Angevin male line opened the door to a prolonged era of crisis that would not fully settle until the early 15th century. The throne passed to his young daughter Mary, who was crowned immediately after her father's burial. Though the transition appeared smooth, it was clear from the beginning that her rule rested on fragile ground. Real power lay in the hands of her mother and leading nobles, while the idea of a female ruler clashed with deeply rooted traditions. The Hungarian nobility expected a king who could personally lead them in war, and many struggled to accept a different model of leadership. At the same time, the political elite was divided over how to secure the future of the kingdom. Some supported Mary's marriage to Sigismund of Luxembourg, while others rejected the idea of inheritance through a female line and instead backed Charles of Durazzo, the last male Angevin claimant. At first, this tension did not erupt into open conflict. Charles was occupied with his own struggles in Italy, allowing the Hungarian court to maintain control. Rebellions that did arise were suppressed, and diplomatic efforts were launched to strengthen Mary's position. An alliance with the French royal house was arranged, and efforts were made to secure internal support through legal confirmations and assemblies. Yet, beneath the surface, divisions deepened. The loss of Poland further weakened the kingdom's position as the Polish nobility chose a different path and aligned themselves with Lithuania. Hungary was forced to accept this loss without resistance, preoccupied with its own internal instability. As factions within the kingdom hardened, opposition to the ruling circle grew stronger. Key nobles openly resisted the Queen Mother's authority, preferring Sigismund as a more suitable ruler. This internal struggle pushed the country closer to civil war. Meanwhile, events abroad shifted rapidly. Charles of Durazzo regained strength and prepared to claim the Hungarian crown. His supporters within Hungary acted in secret, and when he finally arrived, the kingdom was already under pressure from multiple external threats. Armies advanced from neighboring regions, territories were lost, and a sense of crisis spread throughout the land. Many nobles retreated into fortified castles, uncertain of what would come next. Faced with this danger, the ruling faction attempted to compromise. Mary married Sigismund, but the move came too late to stop Charles. He entered Hungary not as a conqueror, but as a claimant seeking unity among the divided nobility. His strategy proved effective. Supported by a large assembly of nobles, he secured the crown and was proclaimed king. Yet his rule was short-lived. Those who had lost power under his arrival quickly moved against him. Within weeks, he was attacked, mortally wounded, and removed from the political scene. His death plunged the kingdom into even deeper chaos. Authority collapsed once more, and no clear ruler remained. The barons formed their own alliance and took control of the government, acting collectively in the name of the realm. While they presented themselves as defenders of order, their true aim was to expand their own influence. Attempts were made to negotiate peace with opposing factions, but these efforts failed. Violence escalated, and the conflict reached a brutal peak when Queen Elizabeth was captured and later killed. With her death, the Angevin dynasty effectively came to an end. Sigismund eventually rose to the throne, but his position was far from secure. He owed his crown not to inheritance, but to election and compromise. To gain acceptance, he was forced to agree to strict conditions that limited his authority. The barons expected to share power and ensured that their influence remained strong. Almost immediately, they began to exploit their position, acquiring royal lands and wealth on a massive scale. Castles, towns, and estates that once belonged to the crown were transferred into private hands. Within a few years, the economic foundation of royal power had been severely weakened. Although Sigismund later attempted to regain control, the damage had already been done. The great estates of the past were replaced by powerful noble families whose influence rivaled that of the king. At the same time, external threats continued to grow. The southern regions of the kingdom were destabilized by ongoing conflict, while alliances shifted unpredictably. Gradually, Sigismund managed to restore a degree of order, suppressing internal opposition and reclaiming lost territories. Yet new dangers were already emerging on the horizon. The expansion of the Ottoman Empire introduced a challenge unlike any Hungary had faced before. Raids began to strike the southern borders, growing more frequent and destructive over time. While the Hungarian nobility favored aggressive campaigns, reality forced a more defensive approach. Efforts to push back the Ottomans brought limited success, and the strain on the kingdom increased. Despite attempts to form alliances and organize large-scale campaigns, the balance of power was shifting. This struggle reached a decisive moment when a massive army gathered to confront the Ottomans in a final effort to drive them out of Europe. Forces from across the continent joined the campaign, creating a powerful coalition. The confrontation that followed ended in disaster. The army was defeated, many leading figures were lost, and the king himself narrowly escaped. The outcome made it clear that the Ottoman Empire could not be defeated through a single campaign. The crushing defeat at Nicopolis did not only shake Hungary's position abroad, it also triggered unrest within the kingdom itself. Almost immediately, opposition resurfaced among those who had once held power. The Lachfy family, led by the former Palatine who had already lost his office years earlier, began to conspire against the crown. They reached out to Ladislaus of Naples and gathered what support they could, though their backing remained limited. Most of the political elite chose to remain loyal to the king, allowing Sigismund to respond swiftly. After returning to Hungary, he lured the leading conspirators into his court and eliminated them. Their deaths were followed by the confiscation of their vast estates, sending a clear message that rebellion would not be tolerated. From that moment onward, Sigismund's determination to rule independently became unmistakable. The influence of the powerful baronial alliance that had once controlled the kingdom steadily declined. Only a few figures retained their positions, while many others were replaced by new individuals drawn from the royal household or from abroad. Among these new allies, Count Hermann of Chile emerged as one of the king's most trusted companions, gaining lands and influence that would make his family dominant in Slavonia. Alongside him stood advisors from distant regions, clerics, administrators, and financiers, many of whom rose rapidly through royal favor. Some of these figures would go on to shape the kingdom's administration for decades. Sigismund's efforts to strengthen his authority were not limited to political appointments. He also turned to reform. In the aftermath of the disaster at Nicopolis, he called a great assembly with the aim of reorganizing the kingdom's defenses. Many of the measures adopted simply reaffirmed older laws, but others introduced significant changes. The nobility, who had long enjoyed exemptions from military service in offensive wars, now found those privileges restricted. In the face of growing threats, they were required to serve personally when called upon and to contribute armed forces based on the size of their estates. Each group of landholders was expected to provide trained soldiers, and penalties were imposed on those who failed to comply. A comprehensive survey of land and population was ordered to ensure that these obligations could be enforced. This marked an important step toward a more organized and systematic military structure. These reforms placed a heavy burden not only on the nobility, but also on the church. Significant portions of ecclesiastical income were redirected toward the defense of the realm, with the promise that the funds would be used for this purpose alone. At the same time, the king reserved for himself the right to reclaim lands that had been granted without proper justification in the past. This measure allowed him to recover valuable resources and reassert control over territories that had slipped from royal hands during earlier periods of instability. Despite these efforts, the challenges facing the kingdom were far from resolved. Sigismund's attention was increasingly drawn beyond Hungary's borders. The affairs of his own dynasty demanded his involvement, particularly in the lands to the north. His brother's lack of an heir meant that future claims to other thrones were within reach, and this prospect required constant engagement in foreign politics. As a result, the king spent long periods away from Hungary, leaving the kingdom in the hands of trusted officials. During these absences, internal tensions continued to grow. Eventually, dissatisfaction among the leading nobles erupted once more. In a dramatic move, they seized the king and attempted to force him to dismiss his foreign advisors. Sigismund refused to yield, even in captivity. For a brief time, the kingdom was governed in the name of the crown itself, as if the throne were vacant. Plans were discussed to replace the king with another ruler, and several candidates were considered. Yet the opposition could not unite behind a single choice. This division proved decisive. Loyal supporters acted quickly, securing Sigismund's release and restoring him to power. A compromise was reached, granting amnesty to the rebels, though the king had no intention of fully honoring the concessions he had made under pressure. Once restored, Sigismund moved carefully but decisively to reinforce his position. He strengthened alliances through marriage and rewarded those who had remained loyal. Key fortresses were placed in the hands of trusted supporters, ensuring that the kingdom's strategic centers remained secure. His opponents, however, were not yet defeated. They turned once more to Ladislaus of Naples, offering him the Hungarian crown and preparing another uprising. This time, their movement was far more widespread, drawing support from both high-ranking nobles and the broader political community. Even so, the rebellion failed. Sigismund's supporters mobilized quickly, dispersing the opposition before it could fully organize. By the time the king returned in person, the outcome was already decided. To reinforce his legitimacy, he staged a public display of royal authority, making it clear that his rule remained intact. The rival claimant, though briefly crowned elsewhere, could not sustain his position and soon withdrew. One by one, the rebels submitted. Some were pardoned, others lost portions of their lands, but widespread reprisals were avoided. By the following year, order had been restored across the kingdom. This victory marked a decisive turning point. From then on, Sigismund faced no serious internal challenge for the rest of his reign. Although resentment toward him persisted, it no longer translated into open rebellion. Instead of pursuing harsh vengeance, he chose a more measured approach. Former enemies were gradually reintegrated, while political power remained firmly in the hands of those loyal to the crown. This balance allowed for stability, even if it did not bring widespread popularity. The foundations of this stability rested on a small circle of trusted allies. Among them, Nicholas Garai and Hermann of Chile stood out as the pillars of the regime. Their loyalty and influence helped sustain royal authority even during long periods when the king was absent. At the same time, a number of foreign advisors played key roles in administration, finance, and military organization. Their presence reflected the king's willingness to rely on talent and loyalty rather than tradition alone. Despite the prominence of these outsiders, the political elite of the kingdom underwent a broader transformation. Many new figures rose to prominence, drawn from established but previously less influential noble families. These individuals built their careers through service at court and gradually formed a new governing class. Their rise reshaped the structure of power within the kingdom, reducing the dominance of the older aristocracy. The administration itself became more sophisticated. A group of specialized advisors began to emerge, bringing expertise in law, finance, and governance. These men were not traditional nobles, but skilled professionals who contributed to the efficiency of the state. Their role signaled a shift toward a more organized and centralized system of rule. At the same time, the king worked to maintain control over what remained of the royal domain. Lands were recovered through confiscation and legal claims, while new grants were made more cautiously. Although the crown never regained the vast resources it had once possessed, further decline was halted. Fortified towns also gained importance during this period, serving as reliable allies of the crown and strengthening the kingdom's defensive capabilities. Efforts were also made to involve the wider nobility in governance. The counties gradually took on greater administrative and judicial responsibilities, becoming more active instruments of royal authority. Over time, they evolved from local assemblies into important components of the state structure. In the later years of the reign, attention turned once more to military reform. Faced with continuing threats, plans were developed to create a more effective army. Instead of relying solely on traditional levies, the system was to be strengthened by requiring landowners to provide trained soldiers. Although some of these proposals were adopted, others met resistance. In the end, the burden of defense remained unevenly distributed, leaving unresolved weaknesses that would become apparent after Sigismund's death. One of Sigismund's more effective achievements appeared not on the battlefield, but in the sphere of law and government. While many of his larger political struggles remained difficult and costly, his efforts to reshape the administration of justice produced more lasting results. These changes were discussed alongside other reforms and were closely tied to his broader aim of strengthening the counties as active parts of royal government. Two questions stood at the center of this effort. One was the reorganization of the court, known as the Special Royal Presence. The other was the ending of a much more controversial practice, the king's personal intervention in lawsuits, a system that had earned deep hostility across the realm. By this time, the kingdom's central courts had long been operating at the royal center, first in one royal seat and later in Buda, which had become Sigismund's main residence. The judicial structure included several high courts, each with its own authority and tradition. Among them, the court connected to the Special Royal Presence grew steadily in importance during Sigismund's reign. In practice, it came to be directed by a powerful legal expert who acted with remarkable independence for many years. He became so central to its operation that the court itself was almost identified with him personally. His judgments could even overturn decisions made by other high courts. Although he wielded immense authority, he remained a strangely shadowy figure, remembered more for his office than for his identity. He never became a landed magnate, and after his death, the court that had depended so heavily on his leadership effectively disappeared in its old form. The ordinary courts of the kingdom, despite their complexity, did not provoke serious anger among the nobility. They worked largely within accepted custom and were seen as part of the normal legal order. What caused resentment was something else entirely: the king's own direct judgment. Sigismund had developed a way of deciding sensitive cases personally, especially when royal interests were involved. This was not a regular court in the formal sense. It was the ruler acting as supreme judge, surrounded by leading clerics and barons, and issuing decisions by personal authority. It could be held wherever the king happened to be staying. That meant anyone drawn into such a case might be forced to travel across the kingdom to appear before him. The inconvenience alone made the system unpopular, but the deeper problem was its political use. Sigismund employed this form of justice in matters that touched his own power, his followers, or lands he wanted to control. He could brush aside the decisions of established courts and issue a ruling by royal favor, often in ways that ignored accepted custom. For many nobles, this seemed less like justice and more like an instrument of domination. During one of the king's long absences, this hated practice was finally ended. After that, the term personal presence no longer meant the king judging cases wherever he wished. It became the name of a regular royal court led through the chancellery and absorbed into the recognized judicial structure of the realm. The reforms of the mid-1430s also aimed to protect lesser nobles from the violence of the great lords. In many parts of the kingdom, abuses of power had become common. Landowners used force to seize property, attack rivals, and ignore local order. Earlier measures had already given the counties some authority to act in such cases, and those powers were now reaffirmed and expanded. The county court increasingly operated with direct royal backing. Its officers were counted among the recognized judges of the kingdom, and they were expected to take formal oaths upon entering office. There was also an attempt to raise the standing of local magistrates by requiring that these positions be filled by wealthier men of substance. Those who refused service were to be fined. Even so, this effort did not really succeed. In practice, these roles continued to be taken mainly by poorer nobles, often men without large landed followings. As the role of the counties grew, their very character began to change. In earlier centuries, a county had primarily meant an old territorial unit, often bounded by rivers, streams, and other natural markers. These frontiers could be so precise that a single village might be split between two counties. But once the county court gained wider authority, especially as a place where nobles of every rank could appeal, the meaning of the county shifted. It came to represent not only a geographical district, but also a legal community tied together by jurisdiction. What mattered now was not simply where a river flowed, but which estates answered to which county court. For landowners, this became an important practical issue. More and more of them petitioned the king to have individual estates attached to a different county, usually one where they held most of their other lands or where local conditions seemed more favorable. Over time, these changes quietly altered the old map of the kingdom. If Sigismund managed to make progress in law and administration, money remained the problem he never truly solved. Throughout his reign, financial pressure weighed constantly on the crown. Earlier rulers had known expense, but Sigismund faced a persistent and exhausting shortage of funds that shaped nearly every aspect of his government. For that reason, later tradition often painted him as wasteful and reckless with money. Yet the reality was more complicated. He ruled during a period of rising military costs, unstable currency, and growing political demands, and even strong royal authority could not remove those burdens. The machinery of royal finance was handled largely by experienced foreign merchants and specialists, especially Italians, and men connected to major commercial centers in Germany. Their influence increased because money itself had become more politically important than ever before. Some financial administrators rose far beyond the level of ordinary officials. One of the most striking examples was Pipo of Azora, who began in commerce and eventually became one of the kingdom's major political figures. Sigismund relied on him not only for revenue collection, but for broader financial organization. At one point, the king even attempted to centralize financial management around Buda, placing key branches of royal income under tighter supervision. This process did not remain stable, and after Pipo's death it loosened again, only to be reorganized once more later. Currency created constant headaches. The value of silver money weakened badly, and the process accelerated during periods of political crisis. Attempts were made to restore order by issuing new coinage and redefining values, and for a while these measures appeared to work. But new upheavals soon undermined that stability. The crown responded by reducing the value of the currency again, and confidence in coinage suffered badly. By the later years of the reign, the kingdom was using multiple forms of money at once, including smaller coins whose quality steadily declined until they were barely trustworthy at all. The result was confusion, distortion in payments, and a deep loss of faith in silver currency. In the end, monetary reform brought only limited relief and sometimes created fresh tensions of its own. Even in the midst of this disorder, the crown still drew income from many sources. Salt remained one of the most valuable of all royal monopolies and produced a very large share of annual revenue. Its administration was closely guarded, and over time the main center of the trade shifted to new producing regions. Yet even this branch suffered from old habits and inefficiencies that no ruler managed to remove completely. Another major source of ordinary revenue came from the long-established tax imposed on peasant households. Though modest at the individual level, it produced substantial income because of the sheer number of taxpayers across the kingdom. Under Sigismund, the collection of this tax became more systematic, with written registers and closer county supervision. These practices helped tie local administration more tightly to the fiscal needs of the crown. Mining also remained important, though not as profitable as it had once been. Gold and silver still provided significant income, but output no longer matched earlier expectations. Trade tolls added another layer of revenue, collected from merchants moving goods within and across the kingdom. Regional taxes also continued to exist, with certain communities paying in forms specific to their traditions and legal status. Royal towns and privileged groups made their contributions in different ways, often through fixed sums rather than ordinary peasant taxation. Taken together, these ordinary revenues still formed a substantial income, and under strong royal control they could yield impressive sums. Yet ordinary revenue was never enough. Sigismund repeatedly turned to extraordinary sources of money, many of which gradually became almost normal features of government. The church bore one of the heaviest burdens. A large share of ecclesiastical income was diverted to the treasury, first under the pressure of war and later as an established expectation. Vacant bishoprics and abbeys were often left unfilled for a time so that their revenues could be absorbed directly by the crown. Alongside this, extraordinary taxes were imposed on peasants, towns, and other groups whenever military or political needs became urgent. These levies could be extremely heavy, especially in times of crisis. The king also made relentless use of mortgages and pledges. Lands, castles, towns, and revenues were repeatedly used to secure loans. Sometimes an estate was mortgaged, then reclaimed, then burdened again for more money. Even loyal supporters were not spared these demands. Sigismund pressed every available asset into service, including lands outside the core of Hungary. On one occasion, whole districts were pledged in return for badly needed funds. Such arrangements could last for generations, showing just how severe the pressure on the treasury had become. All of this reflected a simple truth. Sigismund's ambitions were enormous, and the costs of his rule were equally great. Defending the southern frontier, maintaining authority at home, engaging in Western politics, traveling for long periods abroad, and fighting wider wars all consumed resources on a scale that older structures of royal finance could barely sustain. The empire itself brought him prestige, but little money. That meant Hungary remained the main financial base for his wider political world. In the end, Sigismund built a stronger and more disciplined state than the one he had inherited, but he never escaped the permanent strain of trying to do too much with revenues that were never truly enough. In the later decades of Sigismund's reign, his rule extended far beyond the borders of Hungary and became deeply entangled with the larger political struggles of Europe. After securing the imperial crown and later the throne of Bohemia, his decisions increasingly belonged not only to Hungarian history, but also to the history of Central and Western Europe. Yet the resources that supported these ambitions remained rooted in Hungary. His court, finances, and armies were not divided into separate spheres. The same kingdom that faced Ottoman pressure in the south was also expected to sustain dynastic struggles in the west, imperial diplomacy, religious conflict, and military campaigns across a much wider world. This gave Sigismund's later reign a dual character. On one hand, he remained king of Hungary and ruled it as the central base of his power. On the other, he acted more and more like a European monarch whose concerns stretched across kingdoms, councils, and empires. His rise onto the wider European stage began with the struggle for the German crown. After the fall of the previous ruler, the electors split, and rival claims briefly created uncertainty. Sigismund's position was secured only after the death of his competitor, and a second election confirmed him. With that, he entered the highest level of imperial politics. A few years later, he was crowned in Aachen, formally establishing his place at the head of the Holy Roman Empire. From then until his death, he remained one of the most visible political figures in Europe, moving between dynastic disputes, church politics, and military crises with relentless energy. One of the great tasks that drew him westward was the council held at Constance. Sigismund played a decisive role in bringing it together and in pushing it forward when others hesitated. The council had been called to deal with one of the deepest crises in Latin Christendom, the long division within the church. Sigismund treated this not as a distant religious problem, but as a political emergency that demanded the involvement of kings and emperors. He entered the city in person and remained closely involved in its work. During the years connected with the council, he traveled across Western Europe, negotiated with rulers in the Iberian world, met the kings of France and England, and tried to calm conflicts that threatened to derail the wider settlement. His journeys were not ceremonial tours. They were part of an exhausting diplomatic campaign aimed at removing obstacles, building agreements, and restoring unity within the church. By the time a new pope was finally chosen, the long schism had been brought to an end, and Sigismund had emerged as one of the few rulers capable of working across the fractured political landscape of Europe. No sooner had that crisis been addressed than another opened to the north. The death of his brother placed the Bohemian crown within Sigismund's reach, but it was not handed to him peacefully. In Bohemia, religious unrest had already become a revolutionary force, and many of the estates refused to accept him without major concessions. Sigismund chose confrontation rather than compromise. He backed the call for a crusade against the Hussites and tried to secure the kingdom by force. Although he did reach Prague and was crowned there, his hold on the land remained fragile. Soon afterward, military defeat pushed him back, and for many years his authority in Bohemia survived only in the more loyal provinces on its edges. The war that followed became long, bitter and humiliating. Repeated campaigns failed to crush the Hussites. Imperial armies, regional forces, and Hungarian contingents all proved unable to secure a lasting victory. Large efforts were launched more than once, and each time the result was disappointment or disaster. Even carefully prepared crusading expeditions broke apart under the pressure of Hussite resistance. Sigismund's military reputation suffered badly, yet the war also revealed the limits of traditional armies against more mobile and disciplined opposition. It forced him and those around him to think more seriously about reform, not only in Hungary, but across his wider political world. While these conflicts were unfolding, Sigismund continued to pursue another lifelong ambition: the imperial crown itself. To achieve it, he had to move through northern Italy and navigate a dangerous landscape of rival powers, city-states, papal politics, and Venetian interests. He was crowned King of Italy before finally reaching Rome, but the journey was delayed by war and negotiation. Long months passed in uncertainty before the imperial coronation could take place. When it finally came, it was one of the symbolic high points of his life. Yet even this success came at a cost. In order to secure his position, he had to settle with Venice in a way that confirmed the loss of Dalmatia. Prestige had been won, but not without sacrifice. For Hungary itself, however, the most urgent problem remained the Ottoman advance. After the disaster at Nicopolis, Sigismund no longer believed that a single bold campaign could solve the southern question. He abandoned dreams of grand conquest and adopted a more realistic strategy. The aim now was not to destroy Ottoman power in Europe, but to contain it, delay it, and survive beside it. This meant building a system of defense rather than relying on occasional offensives. It also meant thinking in political terms, using neighboring states as protective zones between Hungary and the empire of the sultans. The moment that made such a strategy possible came after the Ottoman defeat at Ankara. The shock of that battle weakened Ottoman control, threw succession into confusion, and gave the surrounding states room to breathe. Sigismund did not waste the opportunity. Instead of marching south in search of glory, he moved to reshape the political order of the Balkans. His goal was to bring neighboring rulers under Hungarian overlordship, but not in the old, rigid way. Unlike earlier kings who had demanded obedience without offering much in return, Sigismund tried to bind these rulers to Hungary through interest, reward, and flexibility. He granted them estates inside Hungary, gave them reasons to value the relationship, and expected from them not perfect loyalty, but practical usefulness. They were to stand between Hungary and the Ottomans, absorb pressure, and preserve space for the kingdom behind them. Serbia became the clearest example of this system. Its ruler, Stephen Lazarevich, had once served the Ottomans faithfully, even fighting in their campaigns. But after the collapse of Ottoman strength, he shifted course and accepted Sigismund's overlordship. In return, he was showered with lands, titles, and influence. His position within Hungary became extraordinary, and he turned into one of the greatest landholders connected to the crown. More importantly, he served the strategic purpose Sigismund had in mind. He remained a reliable ally and preserved his own principality through careful maneuvering, even while also accepting Ottoman suzerainty when necessary. This balance may have looked contradictory, but it suited Sigismund's policy perfectly. A ruler who could survive between the two powers was more useful than one destroyed in a gesture of defiance. For many years, Serbia shielded Hungary's southern frontier from direct Ottoman attack. Wallachia was expected to perform a similar role along the approaches to Transylvania. Its ruler, Mircea, had already been linked to Sigismund and was rewarded with important estates. Yet, Wallachia was a less stable partner. Its rulers had to fight not only Ottoman pressure, but also the constant temptation to preserve their own independence from Hungary. Even so, the principality remained a crucial part of the defensive system. When Wallachian rulers friendly to Hungary were in power, the southern and southeastern frontier was more secure. When Ottoman influence grew there, the danger quickly spread into Transylvania. For that reason, Sigismund repeatedly intervened, supported rival claimants, and sometimes directed operations in person to stabilize the region. Bosnia, however, proved far more difficult. There, internal fragmentation, religious divisions, and hostility toward Hungarian influence made stable control extremely hard to achieve. Sigismund campaigned in Bosnia more than once, imposed settlements, and tried to install rulers favorable to his interests. At moments, he achieved impressive results. Important fortresses were occupied, local magnates submitted, and Hungarian influence seemed to be returning. Yet these gains rarely lasted. Bosnia's internal weakness made it vulnerable, but that same weakness also made it unreliable as a buffer. Some of its leading lords, once pressed too far by Hungary, turned to the Ottomans for support. When that happened, the entire defensive line was endangered. That danger became painfully clear when one of Bosnia's most powerful nobles shifted sides and called in Ottoman help. The effect was immediate. Hungarian positions in Bosnia crumbled, and for the first time, Ottoman raiders appeared in regions that had once seemed more secure. Hungary responded with a major military effort, but the campaign ended in serious defeat. Many leading men were killed or captured, large ransom payments had to be raised, and, most importantly, Hungarian influence in Bosnia collapsed. Local rulers turned toward the Ottomans, and a region once intended as a shield became instead a corridor of invasion. Only later, after renewed intervention and fresh political arrangements, was some measure of Hungarian control rebuilt there. At the same time, events on the Adriatic dealt Sigismund another lasting blow. Venetian expansion had already been gathering force, and Dalmatia became one of its targets. The struggle was not simply a local quarrel, but part of the wider transformation of power along the Adriatic coast. Venice moved decisively, taking control of key cities and buying claims where force alone might not suffice. Sigismund fought back, opening war in the northeast Adriatic and initially gaining some success. But the conflict dragged on and the balance shifted against him. Armistices followed, warfare resumed, and eventually the last remaining Hungarian footholds were lost. Dalmatia slipped away permanently. It was a major strategic and symbolic defeat, one that later generations would never forget. While these western and southern pressures mounted, the entire defensive structure of the Balkans began to strain. Bosnia faltered. Wallachia was repeatedly shaken by Ottoman intervention. In Serbia, the death of Stephen Lazarevic created a dangerous succession problem. A treaty had tried to regulate the future by placing key fortresses under Hungarian control after his death. But one of the most important strongholds was lost to the Ottomans before the arrangement could be fully enforced. Sigismund attempted to recover it by siege, only to face Ottoman resistance directly. The result was another costly failure. More serious still, it changed the geography of danger. Hungary was no longer protected by layers of dependent states alone. It now stood face to face with the Ottoman Empire itself. The consequences were immense. The southern frontier became a zone of permanent alarm, exposed to repeated raids and demographic disruption. Regions that had once been densely settled began to empty or change character under the pressure of constant warfare. To answer this threat, a chain of fortresses was built and strengthened along the Danube and other vulnerable sectors. This was an enormous undertaking. It required men, money, engineers, transport, and permanent garrisons. In one of the most ambitious experiments of the reign, Sigismund even entrusted a major section of the frontier to the Teutonic Knights. He promised them revenues, taxes, and military resources on a vast scale, yet the burden proved too heavy, and when they suffered defeat, the arrangement collapsed. The attempt showed both the seriousness of the Ottoman challenge and the limits of Hungary's means. As if this were not enough, another danger emerged from the north. Hussite forces began crossing into Hungarian lands, raiding settlements, seizing positions, and exposing the weakness of the old military system. Traditional noble levies could not move fast enough or fight effectively enough against such armies. The devastation of these campaigns added urgency to the military reforms being considered in the 1430s. In this sense, the Ottoman threat and the Hussite threat worked together to transform political thinking in Hungary. Both revealed that older methods were no longer enough. Eventually, the Hussite conflict began to move toward compromise. After years of war, exhaustion, and negotiation opened the door to settlement. Radical forces were defeated, moderate terms were accepted, and Sigismund was finally able to move toward recognition in Bohemia. He spent his last years still engaged in diplomacy, church politics, and negotiations over the future of that kingdom. Even near the end of his life, he remained active in the great struggles of Europe. Death came while he was still on the move, as if motion itself had become the natural condition of his rule. In Hungary, Sigismund's reputation remained deeply contested. Many of his subjects saw only the burdens, the foreign advisors, the heavy taxes, the constant absence, the military defeats, and the apparent willingness to spend the kingdom's strength on distant goals. To a warlike nobility, he did not fit the image of an ideal king. He was known less for battlefield triumph than for negotiation, compromise, and long-range calculation. His talents as a diplomat did not necessarily impress those who wanted a warrior. Yet, from a broader European perspective, he was one of the central political figures of his age. He worked across kingdoms, tried to heal the divisions of the church, confronted heresy, managed dynastic transitions, and operated on a scale that few rulers of his time could match. For all that, Hungary remained the foundation of his power. It was from there that he drew soldiers, money, and legitimacy. It was there that he kept his main residence and invested in royal magnificence. Under him, Buda fully emerged as the kingdom's political heart. The royal complex there was enlarged and reshaped, becoming a true center of power. New churches, residences, and fortifications reflected both royal ambition and the changing culture of the elite. Other noble families followed the example, building more comfortable and imposing residences of their own. The growth of these provincial centers mattered. It signaled that power and culture were no longer concentrated only around the moving royal court, but were beginning to develop new local strongholds as well. Court life also widened the horizons of the Hungarian elite. Foreign envoys, princely gatherings, councils, and diplomatic celebrations brought new influences into the kingdom. Many nobles traveled with Sigismund and saw cities, courts, and customs far beyond Hungary. These experiences did not transform the noble world overnight, but they did broaden it. New habits, symbols, and ambitions appeared, even if older attitudes remained strong. Some foreign figures at court also left their mark, especially those who brought different administrative skills, artistic tastes, and commercial knowledge. In architecture, finance, and style, traces of wider European influence became more visible during these years. Even education reflected this changing world. Efforts were made to establish a university in Hungary, but they failed to endure. Interest was not strong enough, and the institutional foundations were weak. As a result, students continued to seek learning abroad, especially in nearby universities. This too was part of the larger pattern of the age. Under Sigismund, Hungary became more exposed than ever before to the wider currents of Europe, not only in war and diplomacy, but also in culture, administration, and elite life. During the 14th and early 15th centuries, the Kingdom of Hungary underwent a profound economic transformation, one that reshaped its structure in ways not seen again for centuries. This change was most visible in the rapid rise of towns. In earlier times, only a few scattered settlements could be described as true urban centers. But by the end of Sigismund's reign, dozens of towns had emerged across the kingdom, forming a growing network of economic and social activity. Few places illustrate this change more clearly than Buda. Once little more than open land where animals grazed, it developed within 2 centuries into a major city at the heart of Central Europe. This expansion of urban life did not remain confined to the towns themselves. It reached deep into the countryside and altered the rhythm of rural existence. Weekly markets, which had existed for generations, gained new importance, while many new ones were established. These markets drew together people from surrounding areas, including both peasants and members of the nobility. Some of these centers gradually developed beyond their original function and began to take on more urban characteristics. From this process emerged a new type of settlement, known as the market town. These places stood between village and city, acting as economic hubs for their regions. They were not fully urban, yet they played a crucial role in connecting local production with wider trade networks. At the same time, the use of money spread throughout society. By the time of Sigismund, coinage had become the standard medium of exchange across the entire kingdom. This shift reflects a broader change in the economy. More and more people were producing goods not only for their own use, but also for sale. Internal trade expanded, linking distant regions into a single economic space. The kingdom was no longer a collection of isolated local economies. It had become an interconnected system where goods, money, and people moved with increasing frequency. Stability played an important role in this development. For long stretches of time, the kingdom avoided large-scale internal conflict, allowing commerce to grow. Royal authority was strong enough to enforce order and maintain conditions favorable to trade. While it would be misleading to speak of a modern economic strategy, the monarchy did shape certain aspects of economic life. The crown controlled coinage, ensuring a degree of consistency in currency. It also exercised authority over the trade of precious metals and livestock, while customs duties at the borders regulated external commerce. These measures helped bind the kingdom together, both politically and economically. Yet despite this growth, Hungary's prosperity had clear limits. Its development did not match that of Western Europe. Even the largest Hungarian towns remained relatively small by comparison. Buda, impressive within the region, could not rival the great cities of Italy or the major urban centers of Central Europe. This difference points to a deeper issue. In the West, urban expansion had been driven by industry, which generated wealth and supported further growth. In Hungary, such industrial strength never fully emerged. Craft production remained limited, and the economy relied heavily on trade rather than manufacturing. Towns could influence their surroundings, drawing them into a monetary system, but they lacked the power to transform them completely. Trade dominated economic life, and this shaped the structure of towns in fundamental ways. Their locations were determined by trade routes, border crossings, and areas of production. Their social life and governance reflected the needs of merchants rather than artisans. Their political influence remained limited, as they lacked the economic base that had empowered towns in the West. Even the available data on commerce is fragmentary, but it reveals a system heavily dependent on imported goods. Textiles formed the largest share of imports, followed by metal products, especially tools and knives. Many of these goods were luxury items, intended for a small elite, while cheaper fabrics were distributed more widely among the population. Hungary's exports, on the other hand, were dominated by raw materials. Above all stood gold. The kingdom possessed some of the richest gold deposits in Europe, and their exploitation transformed its place in the wider economy. Gold production increased dramatically during the 14th century, and Hungarian gold coins became widely used beyond its borders. This influx of gold affected the entire European monetary system, making gold currency more common across many regions. Other metals, such as silver and copper, also contributed to trade, though none matched the importance of gold. Copper, in particular, became a significant export, reaching markets across Europe and even further east. Agricultural products formed the other major category of exports. Wine was shipped to neighboring regions, but livestock played a far greater role. Large cattle herds began to appear in trade networks, driven across long distances to supply foreign markets. Horses were even more important, both economically and symbolically. Vast numbers were bred and sold, attracting the attention of travelers who described herds roaming freely across the plains. Sheep were abundant as well, but their economic value remained limited, as their wool was not suited for high-quality textile production. The pattern of imports reveals a society where wealth was unevenly distributed. Luxury goods dominated the market, reflecting the tastes and demands of a relatively small elite. Fine textiles, jewelry, spices, and other expensive items were brought in from distant regions. At the same time, the gap between domestic and imported goods was striking. Local products, such as livestock, were relatively cheap, while imported items could be extremely costly. This imbalance made Hungary attractive to foreign merchants, who could profit from the exchange between inexpensive local goods and high-value imports. The rise of towns was closely linked to these economic conditions. Urban centers developed in places where consumption was concentrated, such as royal residences, border crossings, and mining regions. Their growth depended on their ability to connect with long-distance trade. Politically, many of these towns enjoyed a high degree of autonomy. Their inhabitants formed self-governing communities, electing their own officials and administering their own affairs. They were freed from the authority of local lords and answered directly to the king. This autonomy extended to legal matters, as towns often operated under their own laws rather than the customary law of the kingdom. Economic privileges reinforced this independence. Towns were often exempt from internal tolls, allowing merchants to move goods more freely. They controlled their own markets and fairs, which attracted traders from distant regions. Annual fairs became particularly important, serving as major events where goods from across Europe were exchanged. Over time, the number of such markets increased significantly, reflecting the growing importance of commerce. Not all towns were equal, however. Some enjoyed full privileges and strong autonomy, while others remained under greater control. A distinction gradually emerged between fully developed cities, often protected by walls, and smaller settlements without such defenses. The presence of walls became a symbol of urban status. Walled towns were seen as true cities, while others were considered market towns or intermediate settlements. Despite these differences, all played a role in the broader economic network. At the center of this system stood Buda. Its location at a key crossing of the Danube made it a natural hub for trade. Over time, it became the focal point of the kingdom's economic life. Even when the royal court temporarily moved elsewhere, Buda retained its importance. By the early 15th century, it had firmly established itself as the capital. Its streets were lined with stone buildings, its population included merchants from different regions, and its markets drew goods from across the kingdom and beyond. The city itself was divided into distinct quarters. Different communities settled in different areas, reflecting both wealth and occupation. Merchants from Italy, German burghers, and Hungarian residents all had their own spaces within the city. Nearby settlements added to its economic strength. On one side of the river lay Pest, an important market center, while on the other side smaller towns and suburbs contributed to the flow of goods and people. Together, these settlements formed a complex urban landscape, linked by trade and shared economic activity. By the end of Sigismund's reign, this network of towns and markets had transformed Hungary. The kingdom was no longer defined solely by its rural foundations. It had developed a dynamic, if uneven, economic system shaped by trade, resources, and the growing importance of urban life. Yet beneath this progress lay clear limitations. The absence of strong industry and the reliance on external trade meant that this development remained incomplete. Hungary had changed dramatically, but it had not yet reached the level of economic transformation seen in the most advanced regions of Europe. The commercial life of the kingdom revolved above all around Buda and Pest. The great roads of Hungary flowed toward this central zone, linking it with Vienna, Prague, Krakow, and the routes leading toward the Black Sea. It was along these arteries that the kingdom's strongest towns rose. Pressburg became one of the most important urban centers because it stood on the Danube beside the Western Road, leading through Vienna toward the German lands. Sopron benefited from another branch of this western network, while Trnava grew where the route from Bohemia and Moravia entered the kingdom. Farther to the northeast, trade with Poland stimulated the rise of Levocha, Prešov, and Bardejov, and above all, Košice, which stood at a key junction and developed into one of the kingdom's greatest cities. In the east, Transylvania offered perhaps the clearest example of how long-distance trade could create urban growth. Valuable eastern goods, especially pepper, reached Hungary through the Black Sea and passed through the mountain gateways of the southern Carpathians. At these entrances, Sibiu and Brasov became major commercial centers. From there, the roads converged through Cluj and continued westward toward Buda, while Oradea emerged as the main economic center of eastern Hungary because it connected these eastern lines with the routes leading northward. The southern half of the kingdom presents a different picture. Trade there was less dynamic and far less urbanized. Commercial activity toward the Balkans was largely handled by Dubrovnik, whose merchants were mainly oriented toward the Adriatic world. Venice dominated the sea routes, but Venetian merchants rarely pushed deep into Hungary itself. As a result, the south did not produce many major trade cities near the frontier. Apart from Zagreb, which stood out as the center of Slavonia, only a few southern towns reached real importance, among them Pécs, Szeged, and Timisoara. Even these prospered less because of Balkan commerce than because they handled livestock, regional exchange, and Western goods redistributed through Buda. Yet earlier in the Angevin period, the region of Srem had shown unusual vitality. Its towns were once among the most prosperous in the kingdom, and their wealth seems to have rested above all on wine production and long-distance wine trade. That growth did not last. Ottoman raids shattered the region from the end of the 14th century onward, and several once flourishing towns fell into decline or vanished entirely. The life of these Hungarian towns was shaped above all by long-distance commerce. The most fortunate among them were the few that possessed staple rights. This privilege forced merchants, both foreign and local, to halt in a given town and offer their goods there before moving on. It meant that the burghers of such a place profited not only from wholesale trade, but also from resale and retail. At first, this privilege belonged mainly to royal seats, but over time, a few additional towns gained access to it. In practice, however, it remained concentrated in only a very small number of major urban centers. Even Sigismund, though he briefly extended such rights to several towns, quickly reversed himself. Later, he even restricted the old dominance of Buda in order to prevent one city from suffocating the wider economy of the kingdom. The towns also depended heavily on food supply, and this shaped their economic life as much as commerce did. Butchers often belonged to the urban elite, yet most townspeople were not directly engaged in large-scale farming. Instead, urban communities sought to acquire villages and landed property of their own, using them both to secure food and to collect income from dependent peasants. By the 15th century, many towns had become landholders in their own right. In addition, wine production formed a crucial pillar of urban prosperity in many regions. Towns like Sopron, Pressburg, Trnava, and Buda were closely tied to vineyards, and in some of them a very large share of the population owned or leased vines. The hills around Buda itself were once covered in vineyards, showing how deeply wine growing was woven into town life. By contrast, manufacturing played a much smaller role than in the major cities of Western Europe. No powerful export-oriented craft industry developed in most Hungarian towns. There were artisans everywhere, of course, and the larger towns supported dozens of different crafts. But these workshops mainly supplied local needs and everyday goods. The most respected and profitable crafts were those connected to elite consumption, such as goldsmithing and leatherwork. Guilds remained weak, limited in number, and politically unimportant. Even in Buda, the greatest city of the kingdom, organized craft life remained relatively modest. Urban wealth did not rest on industry. It rested on trade, land, provisioning, and connections to long-distance exchange. Even the greatest Hungarian towns remained small by broader European standards. Buda was by far the most impressive, with dense building, extensive storage space, markets, cellars, and stables. But even there, the core population stayed limited. The wider urban cluster that included Pest and the suburbs may have approached 20,000 people by the end of the Middle Ages, yet this was still modest beside the leading cities of Europe. Other towns were much smaller. Pressburg and Košice lagged well behind Buda, and places like Sopron or Bardejov were smaller still. The urban network was real and growing, but its scale remained restrained. The social structure of the towns reflected their dependence on trade. Because urban capital was limited, outside merchants, especially those from the German lands, had enormous influence over Hungarian commerce. Vienna in particular stood above all others, using its own advantages to dominate trade flowing westward. Hungarian rulers occasionally tried to weaken this dependence by encouraging alternative routes, especially toward Bohemia, but the balance never fully shifted. German-speaking settlers had been central to Hungarian urbanization from the very beginning. In many important towns, they formed the dominant urban elite, wrote official documents in German, governed the councils, and shaped legal culture. Even Buda's law code was written in German, and urban office there was long restricted in ways that favored German ancestry. Italians played a different but also important role. They were fewer in number and focused less on local settlement than on high-level commercial and financial opportunities. They preferred the world of great trade, royal administration, and credit. A small number settled permanently, especially in Buda, where they controlled much of the wholesale trade in luxury goods such as spices, silk, and fine cloth. Their influence rose and fell depending on royal policy, but they remained central in financial administration and large-scale commerce. Inside the towns, government was usually controlled by a narrow circle of wealthy merchant families. These families monopolized the leading offices and defended their position carefully. Many traced their origins back to the original urban founders, while others rose later through trade and ties with cities in southern Germany. Although immigrants from the countryside steadily increased the Hungarian-speaking population in several towns, urban power remained concentrated in merchant hands. This helps explain why major social conflicts were rare. In most towns, craftsmen and poorer inhabitants did not develop enough independent strength to challenge the ruling elite. Only in a few places did unrest force concessions, such as broader councils or limited participation by artisans. Buda, however, was exceptional. There, social and ethnic tensions became more explosive. One revolt brought the temporary removal of the old leadership and the creation of a much larger council in which poorer elements were represented. Another later uprising was even more serious, driven by conflict between German and Hungarian factions within the city. The violence forced a compromise, and from then on, the Hungarians gained equal political rights in the town government. This change reveals that even in a merchant-dominated city, ethnic and social pressures could reshape urban rule. Beyond the privileged royal towns stretched a very different urban world, that of the market towns. These filled the gaps in regions where no strong cities had developed. On the Great Plain and in much of Transdanubia, they became the real centers of local economic life. Hundreds of settlements were known by this status, though many of them still looked and functioned much like large villages. Some had only a market and little more. Others developed more clearly urban traits, with craftsmen, merchants, and a more complex local society. These towns served both landlords and peasants, distributing imported goods, collecting produce, and linking rural populations to wider exchange. In livestock regions, they benefited from animal trade. Elsewhere, they handled grain, wine, and cheaper manufactured goods arriving from abroad. Outwardly, however, these market towns still remained simple. Stone houses were rare, and most buildings were made of wood or earth. Yet beneath that modest appearance, social change was underway. A layer of richer peasants emerged, men who went beyond simple farming and began to invest in trade. Some moved up into larger towns, becoming respected burghers. Others sent their sons to study abroad, creating new paths into church careers and literate culture. These places were socially restless as well. Their inhabitants often thought of themselves as townspeople, even though their lords still treated them as peasants. That tension helps explain why certain radical religious ideas found fertile ground there. Hussite influence, for example, spread strongly through some of these market centers, especially in the south, before being crushed by determined suppression. All of this was tied to another major change: the growing triumph of money over older forms of payment. In the early 14th century, silver by weight, mixed payments in goods and cash, and local monetary customs were still common. But during the Angevin period, and even more clearly by Sigismund's time, coin became the universal medium of exchange. The royal penny and the gold florin spread across the whole kingdom, gradually displacing local currencies and older habits of reckoning. What had once been a confusing landscape of regional accounts and different silver standards slowly gave way to a more unified system. By the early 15th century, one common calculation began to dominate. This change did not erase all local differences, especially in weights and measures, but it did show that the kingdom had become a far more integrated market than before. What emerged from all these developments was a more tightly connected economic world. Great roads linked Buda and Pest to the frontiers. Major towns flourished where international trade entered the kingdom. Smaller towns and markets carried exchange into the countryside. Money replaced older local systems and helped bind distant regions together. Yet the limits remained visible. Urban life was expanding, but it was still shallow in many regions. Commerce was strong, but manufacturing weak. The kingdom was moving decisively toward a more commercial and urban order, but it was doing so in its own way, shaped less by industry than by trade, land, and the movement of goods across a broad and increasingly unified market. The reigns of the Angevin kings and Sigismund of Luxembourg represent the high point of medieval Hungary. Over the course of more than a century, the kingdom underwent a deep transformation that reshaped its society, economy, and settlement patterns. This long process of development, which had begun in the 13th century, reached its full maturity by the time of Sigismund's death in 1437. After that moment, the momentum was lost. For centuries to come, no change of equal scale or depth would take place until the modern era. A stable political environment played a decisive role in this growth. Internal conflicts during the late 14th century caused disruption, but their long-term impact was limited. External threats, though dangerous, were still geographically contained. Ottoman forces remained largely restricted to the southern borderlands, while the Hussite incursions, though destructive, were short-lived. For most of the population, daily life continued under relatively secure conditions. Strong royal authority provided a framework that encouraged both economic activity and rural stability, and the driving force behind change remained closely tied to the royal court and its immediate circle. Compared to Western Europe, the kingdom advanced under more favorable circumstances. While the West struggled with demographic collapse and economic disruption following the Great Plague, Hungary experienced relatively few of these effects. The signs of crisis that marked Western societies were far less visible here. Instead, population growth and expansion into previously uninhabited areas became defining features of the period. The result was a narrowing of the economic and cultural gap between Central Europe and the West, even if it was never fully closed. The most visible sign of this expansion was the steady growth of population and the colonization of vast frontier regions. Forested and mountainous areas that had long remained empty were gradually settled. By the mid-15th century, most of the available land had been brought into use, with only a few remote regions still sparsely populated. Over the course of 2 centuries, new villages spread across the landscape in remarkable numbers. Entire regions that had once been wilderness became inhabited and integrated into the kingdom's economic life. This process can be observed clearly in several northern and eastern territories, where settlement advanced rapidly. Areas that had once contained only a handful of villages grew into densely inhabited regions with dozens of communities. Large estates expanded through organized colonization, often under the direction of powerful noble families. By the early 15th century, some of these estates contained over 100 villages and thousands of households. Similar developments occurred across the eastern and northeastern frontiers, where settlement transformed empty land into productive agricultural zones. Population density rose significantly during this period. At the beginning of the 14th century, the kingdom appeared sparsely populated, with vast stretches of land left untouched. By the 15th century, however, the situation had changed dramatically. Hundreds of thousands of peasant holdings were recorded across the kingdom, suggesting a population of several million. The countryside had become more densely settled, and the economic potential of the land was far more fully exploited than before. This expansion also reshaped the ethnic composition of the kingdom. As new lands were settled, many of the incoming populations were not Hungarian. In the northern regions, Slavic-speaking communities became dominant, while in the east and southeast, Romanian and Ruthenian populations spread into newly colonized areas. Although written sources rarely describe the origins of these settlers in detail, the later linguistic and cultural landscape makes their presence clear. The settlement of these regions was often organized by intermediaries who arranged migration and oversaw the establishment of new communities. In the northern mountains, villages founded during this period often followed patterns associated with Central European settlement traditions. These communities were typically established under favorable conditions, including temporary exemptions from taxation that allowed settlers to clear land and establish farms. Once these initial privileges expired, their obligations were clearly defined, usually in the form of monetary payments rather than labor service. Local leaders who organized the settlement process enjoyed special privileges, including control over local administration and economic activities such as milling or brewing. Further east, the arrival of Romanian populations followed a similar pattern of organized settlement. These groups gradually spread into new territories, often at the initiative of local lords seeking to populate and exploit their lands. Over time, entire regions came to be dominated by these communities. This movement of people reshaped the demographic structure of the kingdom and added new layers to its already complex society. At the same time, agriculture itself underwent a major transformation. Older, less efficient systems of cultivation gave way to more organized and productive methods. Land was divided into fixed parcels and cultivated according to a rotational system, with part of the land left fallow each year. This approach allowed for more sustainable use of the soil and supported larger populations. Livestock played an essential role in this system, contributing to fertilization and shaping the rhythm of agricultural life. New farming techniques also appeared, including more advanced plows capable of turning heavier soils. These innovations increased productivity and allowed larger areas to be cultivated. Crop yields improved significantly compared to earlier centuries, making agriculture more reliable and efficient. In some regions, more complex systems of crop rotation were introduced, further enhancing productivity. These changes had a direct impact on the structure of villages. Earlier scattered settlements were gradually replaced by more organized layouts, often centered along a single street. Houses were arranged in a regular pattern, with fields extending outward from the settlement. The typical rural household became more standardized, consisting of a dwelling, farmyard, and associated land. Over time, this village structure became the dominant form across much of the kingdom. Despite these improvements, the village remained a community built on shared resources. Land was distributed among households, but much of it continued to be managed collectively. Pastures and forests were used in common, and agricultural practices were governed by communal rules. This system ensured stability, but also limited the degree of individual independence. Peasant life was structured around the holding, which formed the basic unit of production. Each household controlled a portion of land, along with access to shared resources. Over time, these holdings were divided among heirs, leading to smaller and more fragmented plots. This process created a more complex rural society, with wealthier peasants owning larger shares and poorer families surviving on smaller plots or working as landless laborers. Obligations to landlords remained a central feature of rural life. Peasants paid taxes in money, provided goods on specific occasions, and performed limited labor services. Compared to later centuries, however, these obligations were relatively moderate. Most landlords did not directly manage large agricultural estates, which reduced the demand for forced labor. Instead, monetary payments became increasingly important, reflecting the broader shift toward a money-based economy. Additional burdens also existed, including taxes owed to the crown and the church. Among these was the tithe, which required a portion of agricultural production to be given to ecclesiastical authorities. Other dues, such as the so-called ninth, applied in certain cases to specific types of production, especially vineyards and newly cleared land. These obligations formed part of a broader system that linked rural production to both local and central authority. Vineyards and individually cleared lands held a special place within this system. Unlike communal fields, these areas were often treated as personal property, with greater freedom to sell or transfer ownership. Wine production became an important economic activity in several regions, supporting both local consumption and trade. This added another layer of complexity to the rural economy and provided opportunities for some peasants to accumulate wealth. As economic conditions improved, new forms of taxation emerged. In addition to traditional dues, landlords began to impose extraordinary taxes based on the overall wealth of individual households. Although these taxes could be heavy, they also reflected a more flexible approach that took into account differences in economic capacity. At the same time, competition for labor increased, leading peasants to move toward estates offering better conditions. This mobility became a point of tension as landlords attempted to restrict movement while royal authority sought to preserve it. By the late 1430s, these tensions contributed to open conflict. A major uprising broke out in Transylvania, driven by disputes over taxation and restrictions on movement. The revolt spread quickly and drew support from both Hungarian and Romanian peasants, as well as some elements of the urban population. Although initial negotiations led to temporary concessions, the movement was eventually suppressed by a coalition of nobles and privileged groups. Its leaders were executed and the social order was restored, but the uprising revealed the growing strain within the rural system. The death of Sigismund marked a turning point. His rule had held together the political structure of the kingdom, balancing royal authority with the interests of the nobility. With his passing, that balance collapsed. Power shifted toward the estates, and the authority of the crown weakened dramatically. Within a short time, the nobility asserted its dominance, forcing concessions from the new ruler and reshaping the political system in its own favor. This shift had immediate consequences. Royal power fragmented, and the resources that had once supported strong central authority were divided among competing interests. At the same time, external threats grew more serious. The Ottoman Empire began to pursue a more aggressive expansion, and Hungary found itself increasingly exposed. Without the strong leadership that had defined the previous era, the kingdom struggled to respond effectively. The crisis deepened with a disputed succession. Following Sigismund's death, competing claims to the throne led to a double coronation and the outbreak of civil war. One faction supported a child heir, while another backed a foreign ruler seen as more capable of defending the kingdom. The conflict divided the political community and drew in both domestic and foreign forces. The resulting struggle was marked by sieges, raids, and shifting alliances. Control of key regions changed hands repeatedly, and the kingdom's unity broke down. Some areas fell under the influence of foreign commanders and mercenary forces, while others remained loyal to competing claimants. Towns, nobles, and regional leaders aligned themselves according to their interests, creating a fragmented political landscape. Despite intense fighting, neither side achieved a decisive victory. The kingdom remained divided for years, with different regions recognizing different rulers. This prolonged instability weakened Hungary at a critical moment, just as external threats were intensifying. The era that followed would be defined by attempts to restore order and rebuild royal authority, setting the stage for the rise of new leadership in the mid-15th century. The chaos of civil war unexpectedly brought forward a new figure who would soon dominate the political stage, John Hunyadi. Until that moment, he had been little more than a capable but relatively obscure military captain. His origins were modest by the standards of the great baronial families. His father, Voic, was a noble of Romanian background who had entered royal service and earned favor under Sigismund, receiving lands centered on Hunedoara. From this foundation, the family rose steadily, though without attracting much attention at first. Born around the beginning of the 15th century, Hunyadi spent his early years moving between noble households, gaining experience and building connections that would later prove decisive. His formative years were shaped by service and observation. Like many young nobles of his generation, he learned the art of warfare not only at home but also abroad. A journey to the west exposed him to new military ideas, and a period spent in the orbit of Italian power introduced him to more advanced forms of strategy and organization. By the 1430s, he had entered royal service as a household knight and took part in the defense of the southern frontier, where the growing Ottoman threat demanded constant vigilance. Step by step, he built a reputation as a capable and determined commander, though he still stood far below the leading magnates in rank and influence. Everything changed after the victory at Batasek. In the aftermath of that battle, King Władysław elevated Hunyadi and his ally Nicholas Ujulaki to positions of extraordinary authority. Together, they were entrusted with control over vast territories and strategic strongholds stretching across the eastern half of the kingdom. Their responsibilities included not only military command, but also the administration of key resources, especially revenues derived from the royal salt monopoly. This sudden concentration of power placed them in a position unmatched by any other figures of the time. Although they shared authority in theory, their roles soon diverged in practice. Ujlaki focused on the central and western regions, while Hunyadi took control of the east. It was there, in Transylvania and along the southern frontier, that he established the foundation of his long-term power. The network of castles under his command, combined with lands confiscated from defeated rivals, gave him both military strength and economic independence. From his stronghold at Hunadora, where he built an imposing residence, he ruled his domain with increasing autonomy. Unlike the rest of the kingdom, which remained fractured by conflict, Hunyadi's territories quickly became stable. Once resistance had been crushed, civil strife disappeared from the regions under his authority. This allowed him to turn his full attention to the problem that mattered most: the defense against the Ottoman advance. It was in this struggle that his name began to spread far beyond Hungary. His campaigns against Ottoman forces marked a turning point. Within a short time, he achieved a series of victories that transformed his reputation. Early successes in Serbia were followed by decisive engagements that drove back invading armies and secured the frontier. These victories did not fundamentally weaken the Ottoman Empire, but they had an enormous psychological impact. For the first time in years, it seemed possible to resist the advancing power from the southeast. Hunyadi emerged as a symbol of hope, a commander whose presence alone inspired confidence. His growing prestige soon drew international attention. In Western Europe, the idea of a united Christian front against the Ottomans had gained renewed strength. Diplomatic efforts intensified, and Hungary was placed at the center of a larger plan to push the Ottomans out of the Balkans. Hunyadi was seen as the key figure capable of leading such an abiyan. A campaign was organized, bringing together forces from multiple regions, and in the autumn of 1443, a large army advanced into Ottoman territory. This campaign achieved notable success, though not in the way its planners had hoped. The advancing forces won several engagements and returned with their morale strengthened, but they failed to deliver a decisive blow. Still, the psychological effect was immense. Confidence spread among Hunyadi's allies, while fear grew within Ottoman ranks. The belief that a coordinated offensive could succeed led to even more ambitious plans. Encouraged by these developments, a grand coalition was formed. Its aim was nothing less than the expulsion of Ottoman power from Europe. The strategy was bold and seemingly straightforward. Naval forces would block the straits, isolating Ottoman armies in Europe, while Hunyadi and his allies would strike on land. Preparations moved quickly, and by the summer of 1444, the campaign was underway. Yet events took an unexpected turn. Faced with the threat of a united coalition, the Ottoman ruler sought peace. Negotiations began, and a favorable agreement was offered. For some leaders, including Hunyadi, the terms appeared too advantageous to ignore. A temporary peace was concluded, but even as it was being signed, preparations for war continued. This contradiction would prove disastrous. The consequences became clear when the campaign resumed. The delay allowed Ottoman forces to regroup and move swiftly into position. When the two armies met near Varna in November 1444, the outcome was catastrophic. The coalition army, despite its earlier successes, was overwhelmed. The king was killed, along with many leading figures, and the army was shattered. Hunyadi himself narrowly escaped. This defeat plunged the kingdom into deeper instability. Without a strong central authority, chaos spread rapidly. Local conflicts intensified, unauthorized fortifications appeared, and rival factions seized lands and resources. External enemies took advantage of the situation, and even neighboring powers began to occupy border territories. The kingdom seemed on the verge of collapse. In response, an effort was made to restore order through compromise. A temporary arrangement brought together representatives of opposing factions and established a governing structure intended to stabilize the situation. Military authority was distributed among several leaders, but real power increasingly centered on Hunyadi. His influence, already considerable, now became decisive. In 1446, he was formally elevated to the position of governor, effectively placing him at the head of the kingdom. Although his authority was limited in certain respects, he held the key levers of power. He controlled large territories, commanded significant military forces, and remained the dominant figure in political life. Under his leadership, efforts were made to restore order and rebuild the state. These efforts achieved partial success. Law and administration were gradually re-established, and many nobles returned lands they had seized during the chaos. The machinery of government began to function again, and a degree of stability returned. Yet unity remained incomplete. Powerful regional figures continued to act independently, and foreign control persisted in some areas. Hunyadi spent much of his regency attempting to resolve these challenges. Campaigns were launched to recover lost territories and assert central authority, but results were mixed. Some rivals retained their independence, while others negotiated from positions of strength. At the same time, the Ottoman threat remained ever present. Determined to restore his reputation after the disaster at Varna, Hunyadi launched another major campaign in 1448. Once again, his army advanced into enemy territory, aiming to join allied forces in the Balkans. The confrontation came on the plains of Kosovo, where a large Ottoman army awaited. The battle lasted several days and ended in another defeat. The losses were severe, and once again the campaign failed to achieve its objective. Despite these setbacks, Hunyadi's position remained strong. His reputation among the nobility endured, sustained by earlier victories and the belief that he alone could defend the kingdom. Political alliances shifted, but he continued to dominate the scene. Even as opposition grew among certain barons, his authority remained unmatched. The situation began to change only after the return of the rightful king, Ladislaus V. His presence provided a legal framework for restoring order, and a general settlement was reached. Past conflicts were set aside, and property disputes were resolved through compromise. Institutions that had fallen into disuse were revived, and the structure of government was rebuilt. Yet beneath this surface of stability, tensions persisted. Hunyadi retained immense influence, controlling key fortresses and revenues. His ambition to strengthen his own position brought him into conflict with other leading figures, including former allies. Gradually, a coalition formed against him, seeking to restore a stronger royal authority. As the young king established himself, Hunyadi was forced to make concessions. Some of the resources he had controlled were returned to the crown, and his independent power was reduced. Even so, he remained the central figure of the kingdom, a commander whose legacy was already secured. By the mid-1450s, the balance of power had begun to shift once more. The era of Hunyadi's dominance was approaching its final phase, and the stage was being set for a new chapter in Hungarian history. Hunyadi's ability to remain the dominant figure in Hungary for years was closely tied to the constant pressure coming from the Ottoman Empire. Even after the crushing defeat at Kosovo, open warfare did not resume immediately. Sultan Murad turned his attention elsewhere and agreed to a temporary peace, a policy that continued under his successor, Mehmed II. Yet this pause only masked a far more dangerous transformation. With Mehmed's rise, the Ottoman state entered a new phase of expansion, more organized, more determined, and ultimately more effective than before. The scale of this renewed power became unmistakable in 1453, when Constantinople fell after a dramatic siege. The ancient capital of the Eastern Roman world was transformed into the center of Ottoman rule, and from there, Mehmed began directing his campaigns deeper into Europe. The Balkans were the first to feel the impact. Serbia was attacked again and again, its defenses worn down by repeated assaults. By the mid-1450s, most of its territory had been occupied, leaving only a few strongholds still resisting. It was clear that Hungary would soon face the full force of this advance. Fear spread quickly across the kingdom. The memory of earlier defeats was still fresh, and the fall of such a powerful city as Constantinople created a sense of urgency. Political leaders responded with measures aimed at mobilizing every available resource. A nationwide call to arms was issued, demanding contributions not only from the nobility, but also from the rural population. The scale of these preparations surpassed anything attempted before, reflecting the growing realization that survival itself was at stake. Despite these efforts, the anticipated large-scale offensive never materialized. Instead, Hunyadi carried out limited operations, striking where he could and avoiding unnecessary risks. These actions demonstrated his continued effectiveness, but they also revealed the limitations facing Hungary. Without broader support from the rest of Europe, any major campaign against the Ottomans remained uncertain. At the same time, a different kind of movement was gathering strength. Inspired by religious fervor and driven by popular preaching, large numbers of ordinary people began to rally under the banner of a holy war. This movement, encouraged by the church, created a massive but loosely organized force. By the summer of 1456, thousands had assembled, many of them poorly equipped but highly motivated. The decisive moment came when Mehmed launched a major campaign against Belgrade, the key fortress guarding the southern frontier. His army, large and experienced, advanced with the clear intention of breaking Hungary's defenses once and for all. Hunyadi moved quickly, organizing the defense of the city and gathering both professional soldiers and volunteers. Alongside him stood a charismatic preacher whose influence helped draw even more recruits to the cause. What followed was one of the most dramatic confrontations of the age. The siege reached its peak in July when Ottoman forces launched a full assault on the fortress. The defenders held their ground and the attack failed. The next day, the battle shifted beyond the walls, where Hunyadi's forces struck back. Against expectations, they defeated the invading army and forced it to retreat. The victory was decisive, not only in military terms, but also in its psychological impact. For the first time in years, the Ottoman advance had been stopped in a clear and unmistakable way. The news spread rapidly across Europe. It was celebrated as a turning point, a moment when the tide had been pushed back. Yet the opportunity that followed was not fully seized. The army that had gathered around Belgrade began to disintegrate almost immediately. Internal tensions rose, discipline weakened, and the fragile unity that had made the victory possible quickly dissolved. Recognizing the danger, Hunyadi chose to disperse the forces rather than risk further unrest. Tragically, the triumph was followed by personal loss. Disease swept through the camp, and within weeks, Hunyadi himself was dead. His passing marked the end of an era. The man who had carried the burden of defending the kingdom for so long was gone, leaving behind a power vacuum that would soon lead to new Sanghersh. His eldest son, Ladislaus, stepped forward to claim his place, but he lacked his father's authority and experience. Almost immediately, tensions emerged between him and the royal court. Demands were made for the return of fortresses and revenues that Hunyadi had controlled, and the situation escalated rapidly. Determined to hold on to his position, Ladislaus chose a dangerous path. In a calculated move, he lured his rivals into a position of vulnerability and struck first. One of the most powerful figures opposing him was killed, and for a brief moment it seemed that Ladislaus had secured control. He even managed to take custody of the king, strengthening his position further. But this act, bold as it was, proved to be a fatal miscalculation. The reaction was swift and overwhelming. The killing shocked the political elite and united even former allies against him. Trust vanished, and a plan was formed to bring him down. Through a combination of deception and careful planning, Ladislaus was captured along with his supporters. Accused of treason, he was swiftly condemned and executed. His downfall was as rapid as his rise. Yet his death did not restore stability. Instead, it triggered another wave of Sanghersh. His family's supporters, still powerful and well-armed, refused to accept the outcome. Resistance spread, and fighting resumed across the kingdom. Once again, Hungary found itself divided, its future uncertain. This fragile situation persisted until a sudden and unexpected event changed everything. The young king died without an heir, leaving the throne vacant. With no clear successor, the kingdom stood at a crossroads once more, facing the challenge of choosing a new ruler and rebuilding its shattered unity. Traditional military structures did not disappear under Matthias. The mounted contingents of bishops and great lords still mattered and continued to play a visible role in his campaigns. There were also some attempts after 1459 to restore the old militia portales, yet the true strength of the crown increasingly rested on paid professional soldiers. In this, Matthias stood ahead of many rulers of his age. He was among the earliest European monarchs to build a large mercenary force and keep it in service on a lasting basis. The first of these troops were likely taken into royal service from the followers of Jan Jiskra in the early 1460s, and from then on, their presence became a constant feature of the army. Their numbers expanded sharply during the long struggles in Bohemia and Austria. By the late 1480s, during the review at Wiener Neustadt, the king is said to have inspected a force of thousands of heavily armed cavalry and infantry, with a large share belonging directly to his own permanent troops. This force later became famous as the Black Army. Its ranks were filled largely by Czechs and Germans, along with some Hungarians, while many of its commanders came from outside the kingdom. It was supported by strong artillery, which added to its striking power on campaign. Under the king's firm direction, this army showed its value again and again in war. Yet such strength came at a high price. Even a force of 10,000 men required an enormous yearly sum, and that did not include the cost of defending the southern frontier castles, which had already drained royal resources in earlier reigns. Because of this burden, regular payment cannot always have been guaranteed. In practice, war often fed the army. Looting helped fill the gap whenever money ran short. As long as campaigns continued and success followed, this arrangement seems to have held together. During Matthias's lifetime, there is no clear sign that unpaid mercenaries ever turned openly against him. The older financial resources of the Hungarian crown were far too limited to support such ambitions. Earlier estimates of royal income make that clear. To sustain his military system, Matthias needed more than inherited revenues. He therefore launched a thorough reorganization of finance. In the late 1460s, he placed the management of royal income into the hands of John Ernust, a highly capable official with a background in trade. Under this administration, the treasury became more systematic. Revenue and expenditure could be tracked with greater order, and something like a simple state budget began to emerge. Monetary stability was also strengthened through the introduction of a reliable penny, fixed in relation to the gold florin. Customs dues were also reorganized, and older exemptions were swept aside by redefining them as part of the crown's own rights. Even more important was the repeated extraordinary taxation imposed on the peasantry. From the beginning of Matthias's reign onward, this became a regular instrument of government. It was far heavier than older dues and was assessed through the traditional tax unit of the porta, though in practice the burden often came close to a florin each year. Over time, the levy was demanded again and again, sometimes more than once within a single year. The result was a level of taxation far beyond what had once been normal. Since many tax units included more than one peasant household, the king also tried to widen the base of collection. That effort, however, met sharp resistance, especially in Transylvania, where it helped provoke unrest. Faced with determined opposition, the crown chose not to press the matter to its limit. Taken together, Matthias's revenues reached a remarkable level for the kingdom. Income came from many channels, including the salt monopoly, minting, customs, towns, and above all, the direct burden laid upon the rural population. By the middle of his reign, the crown's annual income had risen to a sum that far exceeded that of earlier Hungarian rulers, though it still remained well below the immense resources of the Ottoman Empire. Even so, it was enough to explain much of Matthias's strength. With greater income came a standing army, stronger government, and a freedom of action that few of his predecessors had possessed. This financial and military power helps explain the stability of his rule after the early crises had passed, but money alone does not fully account for the endurance of his government. Matthias also proved exceptionally skillful in securing support from the kingdom's most powerful men. From the beginning, he could rely on relatives, loyal retainers, and long-standing allies of the Hunyadi circle. Among them, the Szápolyai brothers rose especially high. They received offices, honors, and lands on a vast scale, and by the end of the reign, one of them ranked among the greatest landowners in the realm. Their rise suggests a bond with the ruling family deeper than ordinary service. Yet, Matthias did not limit himself to kinship ties. Like Sigismund before him, he steadily promoted personal followers into the highest ranks of office and wealth. Royal favor created fortunes for military captains, frontier commanders, financial officials, and ambitious men of previously modest standing. Service to the king became one of the main roads to power. At the same time, he was too cautious to base his rule only on men tied to him by family or direct loyalty. He worked to draw support from across the baronial world, including those who had once stood far from his father's cause. Some powerful magnates retained office and influence across decades, even if they had once belonged to rival political camps. Others, who had formerly backed opposing rulers, were reconciled and rewarded. Matthias showed a striking willingness to work with former enemies if they could serve the wider strengthening of royal authority. That political flexibility mattered greatly. Whenever opposition threatened him, he was usually able to isolate it and rally most of the leading men of the kingdom to his side. The church also became a pillar of royal power. Matthias made full use of the crown's control over episcopal appointments. Elections that had already become little more than a formality were effectively ended, and the naming of bishops passed firmly into royal hands. Even papal resistance rarely changed the outcome. The king filled sees with men useful to his government, including relatives of leading supporters, experienced diplomats, skilled financiers, and royal servants whose careers depended on him. Some were foreigners, others came from modest urban or peasant backgrounds. This policy ensured that the higher clergy, like the leading barons, were deeply tied to the monarchy. He was equally determined in reclaiming lands through the crown's right to inherit estates when noble families died out in the male line. During his reign, several great lineages failed, placing enormous properties at his disposal. These lands could then be redistributed in ways that strengthened the royal position. When resistance arose, Matthias did not hesitate to act harshly. Widows, claimants, and local holders could be threatened or pressured until possession was secured. Alongside these inheritances, he also controlled the large wealth accumulated by the Hunyadi family itself, as well as confiscated estates taken from rivals, rebels, or those accused of disloyalty. These resources gave him another means of rewarding service and punishing defiance. In politics, Matthias understood that the greatest obstacle to strong monarchy was not merely individual magnates, but the broader power of the Diet. He could not ignore it entirely, yet he worked steadily to narrow its importance. In the first years of his reign, assemblies were frequent, but over time, their meetings became rarer. This change alone reveals much about the shifting balance of power. The Diet increasingly came to be dominated by the barons and county envoys rather than by large gatherings of the lesser nobility. The towns, though natural allies of the crown, were often kept apart and dealt with separately. The result was a political arena more manageable for the king. In theory, the estates still granted extraordinary taxes in return for repeated confirmations of noble privilege. In practice, many such declarations were ignored whenever they clashed with royal interests. Matthias often accepted conditions in words and set them aside in action. Taxation shows this most clearly. Though he swore more than once not to burden the realm with unlawful levies, he repeatedly imposed extraordinary taxes and sometimes did so without full consent. By the later years of the reign, the estates had grown far more compliant, appealing for moderation while continuing to approve what the king required. He had little use for the old general levy of the nobility, which offered more ceremony than military value. What mattered was cash, and the political nation increasingly yielded it. As the reign advanced, Matthias ruled with growing confidence and less restraint. Power gathered ever more tightly around the king and his closest advisors. Even leading churchmen and magnates could be humiliated, imprisoned, or stripped of property if they crossed him. Government came to rely increasingly on the royal household and trusted officials who executed orders in the counties, castles, and courts. Important reforms also reshaped administration and justice. In the 1480s, a major body of law modernized court procedure, strengthened county institutions, removed older legal customs, and expanded the reach of royal justice. The office of Palatine was also more clearly defined, confirming its central importance in the political order. These measures show that Matthias was not only a conqueror and financier, but also a ruler intent on reshaping the machinery of the state. In his final years, the question of succession became increasingly urgent. His first marriage had produced no children, and his second marriage also remained without an heir. That left only his illegitimate son, John Corvinus. At first, the boy may have been destined for a church career, but as hopes for a legitimate heir faded, Matthias changed course. He openly recognized the child, surrounded him with titles, and began building for him a power base worthy of a future ruler. Estates, castles, and fortunes flowed into his hands, some gained by inheritance, some by confiscation, and some through methods that revealed the king's impatience with obstacles. Marriage plans were pursued at the highest level, and oaths of loyalty were demanded from barons, captains, and towns in preparation for the moment when the throne would stand empty. That moment came suddenly in the spring of 1490. Matthias died in Vienna at only 47 years of age. With him disappeared the last medieval Hungarian ruler of truly commanding stature. His model had never been merely his father, but rather the wider image of great monarchy represented by Sigismund of Luxembourg. His foreign policy, his expansion into neighboring lands, his commanding view of kingship, and even his dreams of higher dignity all reflect that ambition. Much of what he built vanished quickly after his death. His conquests fell away almost at once, and the powerful monarchy he had assembled did not long survive him. Yet his ability cannot be denied. He took hold of a troubled and fractured kingdom and turned it into a respected power. Beyond politics and war, however, another side of his rule gave him lasting distinction. His court became one of the most remarkable centers of Renaissance culture north of the Alps. The taste for this world of learning and art seems to have been encouraged early by John Vitez, a churchman deeply attached to humanist culture. Matthias admired not only scholars, but books themselves. From the 1460s onward, he began assembling a library of extraordinary scale and quality. He sought manuscripts from across Europe, dealt with famous collectors, and employed craftsmen to produce splendid volumes for his court. By the time of his death, the Royal Library at Buda had become one of the greatest in Europe, perhaps second only to that of the papacy. Its books covered both Greek and Latin learning and were valued not merely for their contents, but for their beauty. Most were later scattered or lost, yet the surviving volumes still testify to the scale of his ambition. The same spirit shaped his buildings. Under his patronage, Buda and Visegrad were transformed with new palaces, gardens, and Renaissance forms inspired by Italy. Artists, architects, sculptors, and painters of high reputation worked for him or were linked to his projects. Though much of this splendor was later destroyed, enough survived in description and fragment to show how advanced and unusual this court had become. In these residences, Matthias tried to gather men of letters around him, though success was limited. A few distinguished figures did spend time at court, including astronomers, librarians, and scholars who praised the king and served his cultural ambitions. Yet most of the greatest minds of Italy admired him from afar rather than settling permanently in Hungary. For all its brilliance, this refined court remained isolated from the wider culture of the kingdom. It did not reflect the habits of the Hungarian elite as a whole, and it did not immediately transform them. Among the nobility, literacy itself was still far from common, even among the most powerful families. Many leading men could not even sign their names. Writing remained largely the work of clerics, notaries, and legal officials whose education was functional rather than broad. Their world was shaped by law, administration, and Latin routine rather than by classical elegance. One of the best examples of this narrower culture was the historian John Thurotzi, whose chronicle preserved valuable material but also revealed the limits of contemporary intellectual life, shaped as much by patriotic pride as by critical skill. This contrast helps explain why the humanists closest to the court sometimes felt themselves to be living in a cultural island far removed from the society around them. The world Matthias built was real, brilliant, and memorable, but it was also fragile. It was the creation of one exceptional ruler rather than the natural expression of a wider national transformation. That is why so much of it faded so quickly after his death. Even so, the image endured. Matthias remained in memory not only as a warrior and ruler, but as a prince whose court briefly drew the light of the Renaissance into the middle of Europe. The decades that followed the reign of Matthias reveal a striking contrast in the direction of the kingdom. Under his rule, and that of the two Jagiellonian kings who came after him, the country moved along two paths at once. On one side, there was clear economic growth and a noticeable rise in everyday living conditions. From the late 15th century onward, the kingdom experienced a level of development that brought it closer to Western Europe than it would again reach for centuries. On the other side, society itself became more rigid. The division between landowners and those who lived under them hardened into something almost unbreakable. These two trends were not separate. As prosperity spread and opportunities slowly expanded, the nobility reacted by strengthening their privileges and limiting the chances for others to rise. The pressure between these forces continued to build until it erupted in the Great Peasant Uprising of 1514. Around the year 1500, signs of prosperity could be seen across the kingdom. Some older western towns stopped growing, but this slowdown was balanced by the rapid expansion of Buda, Pest, and many eastern market centers. Trade itself had begun to change in structure. Imported goods still included luxury items such as fine cloth and spices, yet cheaper, everyday products became more common, showing that demand was rising among broader layers of society. Even more important was the shift in exports. Instead of relying mainly on precious metals, the kingdom increasingly exported raw materials produced at home. Copper and cattle became the backbone of trade, eventually surpassing imports in value. Gold mining remained important, and the Hungarian florin continued to hold prestige, but it no longer dominated commerce as it once had. Trade routes stretched in several directions, linking the kingdom to the Holy Roman Empire, Venice, the Black Sea, and Poland. By the end of the 15th century, routes through the Balkans also gained importance, and even merchants from Ottoman lands appeared in Buda during times of peace. The scale of this expansion is reflected in customs revenues, which rose significantly compared to earlier generations. Mining played a crucial role in this transformation. From the 1470s onward, copper production grew rapidly, especially in the region of Banska Bystrica. New techniques allowed for more efficient extraction, including methods that separated silver from copper. Investment flowed into the industry, and large-scale operations produced vast quantities of metal over several decades, generating enormous profits. At the same time, cattle trade reached unprecedented levels. Each year, thousands of animals were driven westward toward Austria and Italy. This trade became one of the most important sources of wealth in the kingdom. Merchants involved in it could accumulate great fortunes, sometimes managing herds numbering in the thousands and employing large groups of armed retainers to protect them. The Great Plain offered ideal conditions for this expansion. Vast open lands, many left empty since earlier invasions, provided excellent grazing grounds. As a result, towns like Pest grew into major commercial hubs, while others, such as Szeged, expanded rapidly in both size and importance. In regions less suited to livestock, wine production became a key economic driver. Vineyards in Western Hungary and areas around Tokaj flourished, and Hungarian wine found eager buyers in neighboring lands. At the same time, internal trade increased and market towns multiplied. Rural populations began to concentrate in larger settlements, creating a form of early urbanization. In some areas, a majority of the population lived in just a few towns, while smaller villages declined. Though many of these settlements retained a rural character, signs of development appeared, including craft guilds and stone-built houses. The remains of such buildings still hint at this period of growth. Despite this economic expansion, the structure of society did not change in a way that allowed widespread upward movement. The system of land ownership remained the defining feature of social life. Land was divided into clearly bounded units, each controlled by a lord who held extensive rights over both the land and those who lived on it. These rights extended to forests, rivers, fields, and all resources within a territory. Peasants worked the land and could enjoy a degree of personal freedom, but they did not own the land in a legal sense. Their holdings remained tied to the estate, and no amount of wealth could turn a peasant into a landowner. This division created a society split into two distinct groups: those who possessed land and those who lived under their authority. Wealth alone could not bridge that gap. The majority of the population belonged to the peasantry, making up a vast portion of society. Among them, there were important differences. Some held land and formed the main productive base, while others had little or no land at all. A smaller group enjoyed special privileges and were exempt from certain obligations. Around the year 1500, an average holding provided just enough for survival. Farming methods remained traditional and yields were modest. Yet not all peasants were poor. Some accumulated wealth through trade, especially in cattle and wine, and could own livestock, valuables, and even significant amounts of money. In contrast, many others struggled to survive, working as laborers without land or resources. The gap between rich and poor within rural society was especially visible in market towns. Some inhabitants lived comfortably through trade and craft work, while others formed a growing class of impoverished workers. Even so, overall living conditions improved compared to earlier periods. Peasants could move freely, carry weapons, and participate in local defense when needed. They were not restricted in their clothing and could enjoy a varied diet that included meat, fish, and other foods. Population density remained relatively low, allowing access to forests and grazing lands. For many households, livestock ownership was common, and daily life, while still demanding, was more stable than before. Estimating the total population of the kingdom is difficult due to the nature of surviving records. Tax systems were based on units that no longer reflected actual household numbers, as families often shared living spaces to reduce their tax burden. Even so, available data suggests a large and widely distributed population. Settlements varied greatly in size, from small hamlets to large villages housing hundreds of people. Regional differences were significant, with some areas densely populated and others nearly empty. The kingdom itself was vast, covering a wide territory that included Hungary proper, Transylvania, and neighboring regions. It was divided into numerous counties, though their size varied greatly. Over time, land ownership shifted heavily toward the nobility. Royal lands declined as rulers granted estates to supporters, and by the late 15th century, most land was in private hands. The church also held property, though its share remained relatively modest compared to other parts of Europe. Within the church, signs of decline were visible. Many high-ranking clerics were more involved in politics and warfare than in religious duties. Some were not even fully ordained, and many relied on others to carry out their spiritual responsibilities. Church offices often went to those with influence or connections rather than those chosen for religious reasons. At the same time, education remained strong among the clergy. Many studied abroad and brought back knowledge of humanist learning. They collected books, supported education, and contributed to the spread of Renaissance culture, even if their influence was limited outside elite circles. Monastic life, however, was in decline. Many monasteries fell into neglect, with reduced populations and poor conditions. Some communities disappeared entirely, while others struggled to maintain discipline. Attempts at reform were made, but often failed to produce lasting change. In contrast, certain religious groups maintained strong discipline and gained popularity, especially those that emphasized simple living and devotion. Mendicant orders, particularly the Franciscans, expanded during this period. They established new communities, especially in towns, and played an important role in society. Their preaching often addressed social tensions, defending the poor and criticizing the powerful. These tensions were not without consequence. As economic growth continued and social divisions deepened, dissatisfaction spread among the lower classes. The ideas expressed by some religious figures gave voice to these concerns, helping to shape the atmosphere that would eventually lead to open conflict. By the early 16th century, the kingdom stood at a turning point. Beneath the surface of prosperity, pressures were building that would soon reshape its future in dramatic ways. One unusual feature of religious life in late medieval Hungary was the very small number of convents for women. Aside from a few communities of Franciscan Beguines, there were only a handful of formal nunneries across the kingdom by the close of the Middle Ages. Some belonged to the Benedictines and Cistercians, while most were in the hands of the Poor Clares and the Dominicans. A few of these houses were far from poor. The Dominican convent on Margaret Island and the Clarist house at Obuda ranked among the richest ecclesiastical institutions in the land. Yet, female monastic life remained limited in scale. The reason is still unclear. Noble families did not appear to place their daughters in convents in large numbers, and this may have reflected the broader distance that much of the Hungarian nobility kept from long-term careers in the church. Whatever the deeper cause, the result was a religious landscape in which women's convent life remained unusually narrow. Alongside the Latin religious world, a small number of Eastern Christian monasteries also existed. From the late 14th century onward, Basilite houses appeared on the estates of Orthodox lords. Their history is shadowy, but they seem to have been especially present in the southern parts of the kingdom, above all in Srem, where Serbian despots held extensive lands. One of the earliest foundations was linked to the lordship of Mukachevo. These communities never became central to the political or cultural life of the realm, yet their presence reveals the mixed religious world of the kingdom's borderlands. Even so, outside the great bishops and archbishops, the political importance of the church remained limited. Lesser church offices and benefices were distributed at court, much like secular rewards, granted for loyalty and service. The real force shaping power and society was not the clergy, but the nobility. And within that nobility, a small number of wealthy lineages were rising above the rest and moving toward a more clearly defined aristocratic rank of their own. The noble class in Hungary was large by European standards. It made up a surprisingly high share of the population, probably more than in most other kingdoms except perhaps Poland. But this nobility should not be imagined in the same way as the landed elites of England or France. In Hungary, noble status did not automatically mean wealth, refinement, or political prominence. At its most basic level, it meant possession of land held by a special legal title. Even a very small estate could make its owner a noble, provided that land was free from servile burdens and direct dependence on another lord. Through that right, the nobleman stood apart from those who lived under seigneurial authority. He was counted among the kingdom's free inhabitants, owing allegiance only to the crown and enjoying privileges denied to the rest of society. For that reason, land was not simply a source of income, it was the foundation of identity, honor, and legal standing. Yet enormous differences existed inside this broad noble class, and those differences deepened over time. As royal estates were granted away and power concentrated in fewer hands, a small number of families gathered extraordinary wealth. By the end of the 15th century, several dozen aristocratic houses controlled a huge share of the kingdom's land. At the summit stood figures like John Corvinus, who held castles, market towns, manor houses, and vast numbers of villages. Beneath the greatest lords stood another layer of important families, and below them a very broad world of county nobles, petty landowners, and noble families, whose way of life often differed little from that of prosperous peasants. Even with these inequalities, the noble class remained fairly closed for much of the medieval period. Only a few paths led upward into it. One route was royal favor. A man of non-noble birth who rose high in the church or at court might acquire land and transfer noble standing to relatives. Another route came through marriage at the very lowest levels. If a noblewoman married a commoner, her inheritance could under certain conditions pass in land to her descendants, and those descendants might be treated as nobles. But such cases usually brought entry only into the lowest ranks of the privileged world. They did not often produce a major social rise. A striking feature of Hungarian society was the sheer number of nobles who were noble in law but poor in reality. Many had no tenants at all and lived from a single holding little larger than that of an ordinary peasant. These men were still recognized as nobles, yet their status was in some ways reduced. They sometimes paid taxes that true landholding lords did not pay, even if at a lower rate. Their rights were not denied, but their place within the privileged order was visibly inferior. Such noble households were found throughout the kingdom, and in some regions they formed the overwhelming majority of landowners. Entire villages could be inhabited almost exclusively by nobles of this kind. Some were modestly comfortable, but many lived in deep poverty, sharing tiny plots among several related families. At the margins, the line between poor noble and peasant could become almost invisible in daily life, even if the legal difference remained important. Above them stood the true lords, those who possessed tenants of their own. Yet even this group contained many who were far from rich. Large numbers of minor nobles controlled only a few peasant holdings and lived with limited means. Their political rights existed in theory, but in practice, their influence was weak. More important in county life were the well-to-do noble families whose estates were large enough to support a more substantial household. These men became the leaders of county assemblies, the deputies of local government, the castellan class, and the retainers through whom greater lords exercised power. They formed the active middle layer of noble society, standing between the magnates and the mass of lesser nobles. But this layer was unstable. The normal workings of inheritance pulled noble wealth downward, generation after generation. Property was divided among sons, and though estates were often kept formally intact, the actual income from them was split into portions scattered across villages. A once powerful family could within a few generations find itself reduced to fragments of land in many settlements, each fragment too small to sustain the older way of life. The history of many noble lineages followed this path. Great houses broke apart through repeated division, and their descendants sank into the world of the county gentry, or even lower. At the same time, other families disappeared altogether. Some died out for lack of heirs, and their lands then passed back to the crown, or were absorbed into larger neighboring fortunes. Across generations, impoverishment and extinction acted as the two great enemies of noble continuity. This process reshaped the landscape of the counties. Some villages became tangled mosaics of tiny noble portions, shared among numerous families whose rights overlapped in confusing ways. Other settlements remained parts of larger lordships, attached to castles and controlled by more powerful families. The contrast between these two patterns reveals the broader split within noble society itself. On one side stood the countless small nobles, divided and local. On the other stood the owners of castles and domains, increasingly set apart from the rest. From this narrower circle emerged the magnates, the high aristocracy of late medieval Hungary. Before the modern age, hereditary titles were rare, and status rested less on formal rank than on practical privilege. What defined a magnate was not simply great wealth, but access to a set of special rights that placed certain families above the ordinary nobility. The heads of these houses gained a hereditary place in the royal council and in the diet, and they also possessed the right to raise military forces under their own banners. These privileges had once belonged mainly to major office holders, but over time they spread informally to a small circle of powerful families and were eventually given legal recognition. By the end of the 15th century, this process had created something new in Hungary. A hereditary aristocracy distinguished not only by property, but by political and military standing recognized across the realm. This development did not occur without tension. In theory, all nobles were supposed to share the same liberty regardless of wealth or birth. The emergence of a separate hereditary elite ran against that principle. Some defenders of the lesser nobility insisted that only those holding the highest offices were true barons, while the rest were barons only by custom or courtesy. But the reality had already changed. A new upper stratum had taken shape, and law eventually acknowledged what society had long since accepted. The rise of this aristocracy also brought a profound change in lifestyle. In earlier centuries, leading men had spent much of their lives at the royal court, where influence, advancement, and wealth depended on personal presence around the king. By the 15th century, many of the greatest lords no longer centered their lives there. Instead, they spent most of their time on their own estates and came to court only when necessary. Their main aim remained the strengthening of family power, but they now pursued that aim increasingly from their own territorial bases rather than from permanent service near the ruler. Their residences reflected this shift. Older timber manor houses were replaced by more comfortable stone castles and aristocratic homes, often built near prosperous market towns rather than on remote mountain heights. These were not merely fortresses. They became the centers of family life, administration, and display. Around them grew miniature courts that echoed royal practice on a smaller scale. Great lords kept their own marshals, chancellors, stewards, physicians, and armed followers. In wartime, these households became the core of private military forces. In peacetime, they managed revenue, stored archives and treasure, and supervised the daily life of the estate. It was also in this period that written administration became more regular within noble lordships. Estate records, account books, and surveys of peasant obligations began to appear more often. Even so, the aristocracy was not yet deeply engaged in economic management in the modern sense. Most magnates still relied less on direct agricultural production than on dues, tolls, rights over peasants, and the control of local revenues. Wine remained the one product that drew sustained aristocratic interest, and in some cases it contributed a very large share of income. After the weakening of royal authority at the end of Matthias's reign, some magnates also expanded their resources by taking over revenues that had once belonged more firmly to the crown. The lesser nobles who served as castellans, stewards, and retainers were drawn into the orbit of these great households. In this way, much of county society began to revolve around magnate residences. These homes became the real centers of regional political and social life. Ambitious nobles no longer looked only to the royal court for advancement. More and more often, they sought opportunity in the service of a powerful lord. This shift marked an important change in the structure of the kingdom. Power was still royal in theory, but in practice it was increasingly filtered through the authority of the great landed houses that dominated local society. By the close of the Middle Ages, the kingdom's noble world had become more sharply layered than ever before. Legal equality among nobles still existed as an ideal, but daily reality told a different story. At one end stood thousands of minor nobles living on tiny plots, clinging to privilege while often sharing the material hardship of the peasantry. At the other stood a small and powerful aristocracy, commanding castles, councils, banners, and broad networks of dependents. Between them stretched the active county gentry, serving, competing, and trying to preserve their place in a society increasingly marked by concentration of wealth and influence. In that world, land remained the foundation of everything. It determined not only income, but status, power, and the right to shape the kingdom's future. Matthias's death lifted a heavy burden from the political nation of Hungary. During the final years of his reign, his increasingly authoritarian style had exhausted allies and enemies alike. Prelates, barons, and nobles had all felt the strain of a kingship that no longer tolerated resistance. With the ruler gone, the dominant mood among the estates was not grief, but relief. Their goal was simple: to free the kingdom from what they saw as years of pressure, arbitrary rule, and constant demands. That desire shaped everything that followed, beginning with the choice of a new king. Several men claimed the throne. John Corvinus, the illegitimate son of Matthias, still possessed enormous wealth and had been carefully prepared by his father as a possible successor, but he faced formidable rivals. Maximilian of Habsburg based his claim on earlier dynastic agreements. Two Jagiellonian princes also entered the contest: Władyslas, King of Bohemia, and his younger brother John Albert, who stood close to the Polish succession. In the end, Władyslas emerged as the preferred choice. He was not admired for force of character or military energy. In fact, those very shortcomings worked in his favor. The political elite did not want another masterful ruler. They wanted a king who would leave room for others to govern. Once the Diet assembled in the spring of 1490, it quickly became clear that Władyslas had the backing of the most influential churchmen and magnates. John Corvinus responded with force. He seized the royal treasury and rallied support in western and southern Hungary, hoping to turn wealth into power. Yet the leading barons moved just as quickly. Their armies, commanded by men of long experience, defeated Corvinus's forces in the field. With that, the military path to the crown collapsed. Władyslas was chosen by the great lords, accepted the conditions placed before him, and was crowned soon after. Corvinus was not stripped of everything. He kept a remarkable collection of castles and titles, enough to remain one of the greatest lords in the realm. But the enormous territorial base that Matthias had assembled for him could no longer serve as the foundation of royal authority. The barons had prevented that outcome. The new ruler's success was strengthened by the support of Queen Beatrice, who still mattered enormously because of her wealth and position. During Matthias's lifetime, she had strongly opposed the succession of her stepson. After the king's death, she hoped to preserve her influence by tying herself to the new monarch. Władyslas promised marriage, and the ceremony was carried out in secrecy soon after his coronation. She raised money from her estates to assist him, believing she had secured her place at the center of power. But the marriage rested on deception. Before the wedding, the king had already declared privately that he was entering it under pressure and did not consider it binding. Once his rule became secure, he moved to end the union. The dispute became a public scandal and dragged on for years before the marriage was finally annulled. Beatrice's lands were confiscated and she returned to Naples, broken politically and personally. While these domestic struggles unfolded, the structure created by Matthias began to dissolve with astonishing speed. His empire outside Hungary did not survive him. Moravia, Lusatia, and Silesia slipped away almost immediately and returned to the Bohemian crown. The conditions once attached to their recovery were never fulfilled. In Austria, the collapse was just as swift. Maximilian gained recognition in Vienna soon after Matthias's death and attracted several men who had once served the late king. Some frontier commanders surrendered key positions without prolonged resistance. For a short time, Maximilian pushed deep into Western Hungary, but financial weakness forced him to halt. He lacked the means to maintain a serious campaign, and many of his supporters fell away. Events in the West also redirected his attention. That opened the way for a settlement. The treaty that followed was deeply unfavorable to Hungary. Vladislas gave up Matthias's conquests in Austria, returned the lands long held by the Habsburgs as security, and accepted the Habsburg dynastic claim to the Hungarian throne. He also agreed to pay a large indemnity. These concessions shocked many in the kingdom, especially because they had not been forced by a clear military defeat. When the Diet met afterward, the reaction was explosive. Accusations of betrayal flew across the assembly, and public anger rose so high that open unrest seemed close. Only after tempers cooled did the leading men manage to secure ratification. The struggle for the throne was still not over. John Albert launched armed moves of his own, seizing border castles and marching into the kingdom. Yet by this point, Vladislas had gained enough ground to respond effectively. Troops returning from the Western conflict were turned against the Polish claimant, and he was eventually driven out. Peace followed between the brothers, and Vladislas could finally present himself as the bringer of order after the storm that followed Matthias's death. Though already king of Bohemia, Vladislas treated Hungary as his main realm. He promised to reside in Buda and largely kept that promise. He spent only limited time in Bohemia during his long reign, yet his presence in Hungary did not mean energetic rule. He rarely traveled far from the capital. He showed little appetite for war, little desire for diplomacy beyond what necessity required, and little enthusiasm for the burdens of government. Hunting, food, and ease seemed to have suited him far more than the exercise of power. He attended council meetings dutifully, but usually let others conduct affairs. He became known for a habit of passive agreement, responding with a mild phrase that suggested assent without direction. Such a king was exactly what many of the leading men had wanted. The cost of that choice soon became clear. A new political order emerged under Vladislas. Outwardly, nothing fundamental had changed. Hungary remained a monarchy, but the center of authority no longer functioned as it had under Matthias. The king did not rule decisively, and the result was a state increasingly governed by collective bargaining, competing interests, and weak coordination. The royal council gained enormous weight because decisions that had once depended on the ruler now had to be made by groups of powerful men. At the same time, the Diet returned to political life with extraordinary force. Under Matthias, it had been pushed aside. Now, it met constantly. Sessions became a regular feature of public life, and in some years, more than one assembly gathered. The kingdom entered a new parliamentary age, but not one marked by harmony or effective government. The Diet represented the free landholding element of the realm. Its upper level consisted of prelates, barons, and other prominent office holders. Its lower level represented mainly the county nobility. These two bodies met separately but worked within the same political space. The pattern had developed gradually over the 15th century, and by this period had taken on a more stable form. The nobility of the counties usually appeared through envoys rather than in person, though from time to time armed and crowded gatherings assembled in large numbers. The field of Rakos outside Pest became especially famous as the place where such political assemblies took shape. In theory, the royal towns also had a place in this world, but in practice they were often excluded or marginalized. The Diet had become, above all, the organ of the nobility. At the same time, a powerful political language was taking shape inside this world of assemblies. The most influential mind in giving it form was Stephen Werbotzy. Rising from relatively modest noble origins, he became one of the leading public figures of the age. He possessed an exceptional command of Hungarian customary law and knew how to frame noble ambitions in language that was both forceful and memorable. His great legal compilation, completed in the second decade of the 16th century, was never formally enacted as the official law of the kingdom, but it quickly achieved enormous authority. It offered the nobility a complete vision of itself, its rights, its historical mission, its superiority over other groups, and its claim to guide the state. At the heart of this ideology stood a powerful myth of origin. The nobility was presented as the true Hungarian nation, descended from ancient warrior peoples whose valor and liberty stretched back into legendary time. Their ancestors were imagined as conquerors and defenders, a people naturally made for war and rule. In this story, noble privilege rested on ancient freedom and inherited martial virtue. Those who had failed in courage had supposedly fallen into servile condition, and their descendants became the peasantry. By contrast, the nobleman remained the bearer of original liberty. This was not simply a romantic tale. It justified social inequality, political leadership, and the exclusion of others from power. Werbotzy also gave sharp legal form to noble privilege. The nobleman could not be arrested without due process. He acknowledged no ordinary superior other than the lawful king. He was entitled to full enjoyment of the revenues and rights attached to his estate, and if the ruler violated the liberties of the realm, he had the right to resist without being treated as a traitor. These ideas, drawn from earlier traditions but now sharpened into a coherent doctrine, gave the nobility a political creed of extraordinary durability. From this grew the doctrine of the Holy Crown, one of the most important constitutional ideas in Hungarian political thought. In this view, the crown was not merely the ornament of the ruler, but the symbol of the whole political community. Authority did not flow solely downward from a hereditary monarch. It also rested on the noble estate, which was seen as the living body of the realm. The king and the political nation were linked through the crown in a kind of shared order. Because of that, the right to choose a ruler and to defend the liberties of the realm ultimately remained with the community of nobles. In effect, the doctrine created the ideological basis for a noble commonwealth under a king rather than an unrestricted monarchy. This way of thinking had lasting consequences. It encouraged the nobility to imagine itself as the natural master of the kingdom, entitled to govern without accepting corresponding burdens. It deepened attachment to old customs and sharpened suspicion of novelty. It also fed an early and intense hostility toward foreigners. Anyone who seemed alien to the traditions of the realm could be treated as a danger. These feelings had long existed, but now they were given new force in public debate. They were especially powerful among the lesser nobility, who found dignity in an ideal that praised martial simplicity over refinement or learning. In that vision, poverty, roughness, and even illiteracy could be transformed into virtues if they were linked to ancient freedom and military courage. Yet this ideology did not mean that the entire nobility acted as a united political force. Most nobles remained outside daily political maneuvering. Many lived on their lands and avoided public struggle. Others fought on the frontiers. Those who did take part in political life often did so through dependence on a greater lord. Active politics remained in the hands of a relatively small upper layer of county gentry, men who served as spokesmen, council members, legal officials, and intermediaries between magnates and local society. For that reason, political conflict in this period was not a simple struggle between barons and lesser nobles. It was more often a contest among baronial groups, each supported by networks of dependents and allies. The formal center of government remained the royal council, but it too reflected the fragmented nature of power. In theory, it spoke for the king. In practice, it was dominated by a smaller inner circle. The great offices of state still mattered, especially the palatine, the judge royal, and the chief financial and court officers. But the most influential figure was often the chancellor, because he controlled the seals and stood at the point where royal authority passed into written action. Whoever held that office was uniquely placed to shape appointments, grants, policy, and access to the king. Several remarkable men used this position to great effect. Urban Nagaluksi played an important role at the beginning of the reign, but after his death, Thomas Bakoch rose above all others. Bakoch had humble origins, yet became one of the most powerful churchmen and political figures in the kingdom. Highly educated and deeply familiar with the culture of Renaissance Europe, he also had a formidable instinct for power and property. He accumulated benefices, advanced relatives, and expanded his landed base whenever possible. Though often criticized for greed and favoritism, he remained central to government for many years. Even when the estates managed to weaken his formal control, much of his influence survived through men loyal to him. One of those men was George Satmari, another gifted churchman of urban background who had studied abroad and mastered the workings of government. He too became a bishop and a leading royal official. Together, such men formed a distinctive administrative class. They were often clerics by office, but in outlook they behaved like secular statesmen. They were educated, capable, and in many cases genuinely skilled in administration. If the kingdom struggled, the reason was not a lack of intelligence among its servants. The deeper problem lay in the structure of power itself. Alongside these officials stood a small group of major lay dignitaries, especially the palatines and other great officers. Many came from the upper aristocracy, while some rose from the gentry. They did not always agree among themselves, but they generally shared a desire to keep the ambitions of the lower political nation under control. At the same time, the king's own position was constrained from the beginning. Before his election, he had been forced to swear that he would respect the liberties of the estates, abandon the oppressive innovations associated with Magyars, and avoid new extraordinary taxes. He also promised to reserve dignities, lands, and influence for natives of the realm rather than foreigners. Even the custody of the crown itself was placed under tight supervision. These promises, later reinforced in law, sharply narrowed the freedom of the monarchy. The Diet, empowered by this new balance, moved quickly to extend its reach. Its members produced a flood of legislation, much of it contradictory or repeatedly renewed because enforcement was weak. The leading nobles wanted representation in the law courts and on the royal council, and they sought to make those bodies less dependent on the court. They also worked to strengthen county authority against both royal power and magnate overreach. Local nobles wanted more say in the appointment of county deputies and more control over local administration. In some cases, they succeeded. In others, the court blocked or diluted their demands. Yet the pattern was clear. The estates wanted to turn the kingdom into a political order in which their consent and participation were essential. Their ambitions also struck other groups. The church faced restrictions on jurisdiction and legal influence. The towns suffered repeated attacks on their privileges. Noble hostility toward urban communities had several causes. Towns operated under their own legal customs, and many were heavily German-speaking, which made them objects of distrust. Economic conflict also sharpened this hostility, as nobles increasingly wished to market their own produce and resented urban protections. Laws were passed to shield noble property from urban taxation, reduce tolls on noble trade, and subject some urban economic activities to noble jurisdiction. Over time, even the idea that towns should count as full political members of the realm was pushed aside. Their place in national politics weakened steadily. The peasantry bore the heaviest cost of this new order. Long before open revolt, signs had appeared that the noble estate intended to narrow peasant freedoms. Legal disabilities increased. Peasants were excluded from certain forms of testimony and public authority. Hunting, once permitted, was restricted. Most importantly, the right of movement came under growing attack. Under Matthias, peasants had in practice moved with considerable freedom. After 1490, the estates increasingly tried to subject departure from one lord to legal controls, mediation, and local approval. Lords who harbored runaway tenants were threatened with punishment. These measures did not yet destroy peasant mobility entirely, but they revealed unmistakably where noble policy was headed. At the same time, peasant burdens grew heavier. Lords increasingly preferred dues in kind rather than in cash, hoping to profit directly from favorable market conditions. The ninth, long known in some settings, was now enforced more broadly and became one of the heaviest regular obligations on peasant production. Restrictions on cattle export struck particularly at prosperous peasant communities in market towns. Even groups that had once held special status, such as the Cumans and the Magyars, saw their older liberties eroded and their position pushed downward toward that of ordinary royal tenants. Different contemporaries interpreted the rule of the estates in different ways. Some barons imagined an oligarchy, with the royal council truly governing while the diet remained largely symbolic. Leaders of the nobility dreamed instead of a political system in which king and realm ruled together through the diet. In practice, neither ideal took stable form. Their combined effect was paralysis. Royal authority weakened, but no efficient substitute took its place. That failure appeared most clearly in finance. Władysław inherited an empty treasury and never escaped that condition. Royal income fell far below what Magyars had once commanded. Some sources of revenue had shrunk, others were pawned away, and still others were handed over in practice to magnates, prelates, or mortgage holders. Royal towns were pledged to secure military costs that the king could not cover from ordinary income. The 1 florin tax became the chief resource of the crown, but even that was collected inefficiently and distributed unevenly. A large share disappeared into expenses, exemptions, and private retention. Leading barons were allowed to keep what was raised on their lands to pay their own forces. Attempts to redefine and divide the subsidy only deepened confusion. In theory, the new arrangements aimed at fairness and defense. In reality, they undermined the fiscal basis of the state. The court survived partly by improvisation. Small inheritances, exceptional gifts, and foreign subsidies mattered greatly. Papal and Venetian money became especially important, and without such outside support, the kingdom's financial position would have been even more desperate. Yet dependence on irregular help was no solution to structural weakness. Military decline followed the same path. The great lords wanted Matthias's mercenary army destroyed, and they achieved that goal. The once feared force dissolved in chaos and violence, and what remained was crushed. In its place came laws that attempted to revive older military forms through obligations tied to estates and counties. Prelates, barons, and other wealthy men were assigned quotas of armed horsemen, while county levies were reorganized around a revived system of militia based on tax units. On paper, this looked like a restoration of national defense. In practice, it encouraged the maintenance of private armies and diverted revenue away from the center. The cost of defending the frontiers remained enormous. Southern castles, garrisons, supplies, and construction demanded sums the treasury could rarely provide. Soldiers were often unpaid, and when unpaid, they survived by plunder and by ransoming captives. Responsibility was diffuse, and blame spread in every direction. Nobles accused barons and prelates of serving private interest instead of the common good. Popular anger grew. Preachers denounced the mighty. Public frustration turned against ministers and financiers. The sense spread that the kingdom's leaders were consuming its resources while neglecting its safety. Meanwhile, the Ottoman threat steadily increased. Raids became regular from the early years of Władysław's reign. At first, the defensive line seemed to hold. Victories were still won, heads of fallen enemies still displayed, and castles still resisted. But defeats began to break through the illusion. A major disaster in Croatia showed how fragile the frontier had become. Truces were signed when circumstances allowed, especially when wider European wars distracted the Sultan. Venice at times allied with Hungary and supplied money. Yet none of this removed the underlying danger. When peace agreements were renewed, they often concealed weakness rather than strength. The kingdom also wasted energy on internal conflicts that now appear tragically misplaced. A major campaign was mounted against one of the most powerful southern lords after he insulted the king. Troops marched not to confront the Ottomans, but to discipline a magnate near the frontier. The action succeeded, and contemporaries could still reassure themselves that the military machine worked. Yet such episodes only highlighted how far priorities had drifted from reality. In foreign affairs, Hungary still looked like a major power for a time. The court tried to follow a cautious policy shaped above all by the Ottoman danger. Peace with neighbors was essential. Alliances with Poland and France were renewed and expanded. Dynastic marriages linked the kingdom to wider European networks. The remarriage of Ladislas briefly seemed to open new possibilities, especially under the influence of a younger queen who may have hoped for a more active monarchy. But her early death cut that hope short. Relations with the Habsburgs remained relatively calm despite deep suspicion, and family arrangements were made that would later prove fateful. Yet sober diplomacy was often undermined by the anti-foreign passions of the nobility, above all by hostility to Germans and Habsburg influence. Public speeches at the Diet turned this feeling into a political weapon. Foreign rulers were blamed for the sufferings of the realm, while Hungarian-born kings were praised as the true defenders of the nation's honor. Out of this mood came solemn declarations that no foreign king should ever again be elected. Behind those declarations stood a clear political implication. A powerful native magnate, above all John Zápolyai, could one day claim the crown with the backing of the estates. John Zápolyai towered over the political landscape. With his vast landed base and immense regional power, he was the one lord who could genuinely inspire broad support among the nobility. His rise was watched with fascination and anxiety alike. In him, many saw a possible future leader of the nation, much as earlier generations had once rallied around John Hunyadi. Yet, the monarchy remained intact, and Vladislas's son was eventually crowned despite resistance. The kingdom thus moved forward under unresolved tensions rather than clear settlement. By the second decade of the 16th century, the military situation had worsened sharply. New Ottoman leadership brought renewed aggression. Important strongholds fell, and the pressure on the southern line increased. Small victories could no longer hide the scale of the danger. At the very moment when the frontier crisis deepened, Hungary was hit by one of the greatest internal upheavals in its history. The Peasant War of 1514 erupted in a kingdom already weakened by political division, fiscal breakdown, military exhaustion, and a ruling order more committed to privilege than to coordinated defense. What followed would expose all the weaknesses that had taken shape since the death of Matthias. The uprising did not begin with a clear warning. For years, anger had been building among the peasantry, fed by heavier burdens, shrinking freedoms, and growing inequality. Yet that anger remained hidden, almost invisible, until it suddenly erupted. Even those who would soon take part in the revolt likely did not foresee how quickly events would spiral into open war. Its origins were tied, in an indirect way, to the Ottoman threat, but the immediate spark came from an unexpected direction. After the death of Pope Julius, one of Hungary's most powerful churchmen sought the papal throne and invested enormous wealth in the effort. When he failed, the new pope granted him a different form of authority: the right to call for a crusade against the Ottomans. That decision set in motion a chain of events no one could fully control. The call to arms spread rapidly across the countryside. Priests and friars traveled from village to village, urging men to take up the cross. The response was overwhelming. Tens of thousands of peasants gathered, many of them leaving their fields at a critical moment in the agricultural cycle. Camps formed near major centers, especially around Pest, where a large force assembled. A seasoned soldier named George Dossa was chosen to lead them. He had fought on the southern frontier and knew the reality of war. At first, everything seemed to follow a familiar pattern. The army began to move toward the south, as if preparing to confront the Ottomans. But tension was already rising behind the lines. Landowners watched their workforce disappear just as the harvest approached and tried to hold them back. Clashes broke out between armed peasants and local nobles. Violence spread and discipline weakened. The marching army began to seize supplies, but instead of targeting neutral resources, it turned increasingly against noble estates. Taxes and obligations were openly refused. What had begun as a crusade was slowly turning into something else. Alarmed by the growing disorder, the leadership attempted to halt the movement. Recruitment was stopped, and soon after, the assembled forces were ordered to disband. By then, it was too late. Many peasants ignored the command. Some had already fought and defeated small noble forces. The sense of injustice had taken hold, and the idea of returning quietly to servitude was no longer acceptable. The turning point came when Doza refused to obey orders and pressed on. His troops clashed with forces sent to contain them. After an early setback, he struck back with speed and brutality, capturing and executing high-ranking opponents. From that moment, the conflict could no longer be reversed. It had become a full-scale revolt. The rebellion spread rapidly across the Great Plain and into several regions of the kingdom. It drew in not only peasants, but also townsmen, lesser nobles, and armed retainers known for their military experience. Leadership remained fragmented, with multiple groups acting independently. Their goals were not clearly defined, but there were signs of a deeper ambition. Some seemed to imagine a society without the dominance of landlords, perhaps inspired by older models of freedom. Their fury was directed not only at individuals, but also at records and symbols of authority, which they destroyed wherever they could. By early summer, large parts of the countryside were in open conflict. Rebel forces captured towns, besieged strongholds, and advanced toward key defensive centers. One column moved along the Danube, attacking fortresses in the south. Another force pushed eastward. The main army, led by Dosa, struck at one of the most important fortified cities in the region and laid siege to it. The government proved incapable of responding quickly. Central authority was too weak to organize a coordinated defense. Instead, powerful regional leaders took matters into their own hands, rallying local nobles and forming ad hoc armies. At first, the rebels achieved some successes, but the balance gradually shifted. Organized resistance began to take shape. Rebel camps were broken, and their advances slowed. The decisive moment came when a major noble commander marched swiftly to relieve the besieged city and confronted Dosa's forces. The battle ended in disaster for the rebels. Their army collapsed, and their leader was captured. His execution was carried out with deliberate cruelty, intended as a warning to all who might follow his example. Within a matter of weeks, the revolt was effectively crushed. The aftermath was harsh but calculated. The leaders were executed, but there was no widespread slaughter of the general population. Landowners needed labor, and total destruction would have been self-defeating. Instead, punishment took a different form. Laws were introduced that reshaped the status of the peasantry. Their freedom of movement was severely restricted. Their obligations were fixed in harsher terms. The possibility of rising beyond their station was effectively closed. The revolt did not destroy the social order, but it hardened it. The suppression of the uprising elevated certain figures and weakened others. Those who had failed to control the crisis lost influence, while those who had defeated the rebels gained prestige. Among them, one magnate stood out above all others, strengthening his position as a potential future ruler. His power, wealth, and military success made him a central figure in the kingdom's politics. At the same time, the royal court sought to counterbalance this rising influence by turning toward external alliances. A major diplomatic shift followed. Agreements were made with powerful neighboring dynasties, including marriage arrangements that would shape the future of the region. These decisions laid the groundwork for a new political alignment, one that would later prove decisive. When the king died, he left behind a young heir, still a child, along with a state burdened by debt and internal division. Power fell into the hands of guardians, advisors, and rival factions. The following years were marked by instability. Political groups formed and dissolved, alliances shifted, and authority became increasingly fragmented. Laws continued to be issued, but few were enforced. Decision-making became chaotic, and no clear direction emerged. Foreign policy suffered as a result. While some leaders recognized the growing Ottoman threat, others underestimated it or refused compromise. Negotiations were carried out in secret, while public opinion resisted any appearance of weakness. Temporary truces were signed, but they did not resolve the underlying danger. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire expanded elsewhere, consolidating its power before turning its attention westward again. When a new ruler came to power, he initially offered peace. That offer was rejected. Soon after, a full-scale invasion began. Key fortresses fell one by one. Strategic positions that had once protected the heart of the kingdom were lost. Defensive lines collapsed, and no effective response could be organized. Attempts at reform came too late. Financial decisions, such as currency debasement, briefly increased revenue but ultimately weakened the economy further. Resources dwindled and the ability to sustain war declined. Despite the growing crisis, internal conflict continued. Rival factions fought for control, accused each other of betrayal, and demanded radical changes. At one point, the kingdom came close to civil war. Leadership changed hands repeatedly, and authority shifted from one group to another. Only at the last moment did a temporary consolidation occur, driven in part by determined figures at court who sought to restore order. For a brief time, it seemed possible that the state might recover. Stronger leadership, clearer policies, and renewed authority began to take shape. But the opportunity came too late. The Ottoman army was already on the move. The invasion was massive and well organized. It advanced methodically, capturing key positions and crossing major rivers without serious resistance. The Hungarian army gathered in response, but it was smaller, less coordinated, and composed of a mix of forces with varying levels of discipline and experience. The two sides met on the plain near Mohács. The battle that followed was swift and devastating. In less than 2 hours, the Hungarian army was destroyed. Many of the kingdom's leading figures were killed, including high-ranking churchmen and nobles. The infantry fought bravely, but was overwhelmed. The king himself died while attempting to flee, his armor dragging him down as he tried to cross a flooded stream. With that defeat, the medieval Kingdom of Hungary effectively collapsed.